Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our virtual Change Through Community workshop. Whether you joined for day 1 or if you're hopping on for the first time today, we're really glad you're here. Yesterday, we launched our Change Through Community video, which we created with the amazing artist, Miss Diabetes. If you didn't catch it, it's now available on our YouTube channel, and we'll share the link in the chat box now, so check it out. On day 1 of the workshop, we heard from some incredible speakers, including perspectives from advocates in 5 different countries about the advocacy that they're carrying out in their communities. We heard from advocates who lost loved ones despite all odds, and who've lost loved ones, and despite all odds, they found ways to turn their grief into action. We heard information about diabetes psychology, and we were able to do some thinking about the mental health side of diabetes as well. We learned about pharma's profiteering through shares and patents, and we heard about advocacy through divestment campaigns, giving us lots of various tools to use for Insulin for All activism. If you missed any of the sessions yesterday, don't worry, we'll be sharing them on our YouTube channel along with today's talks next week. We ended day 1 of our workshop yesterday with an incredible performance by Maria Issa, which kicked off our digital demonstration for one decision, asking Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi to make one decision, to lower the list price of insulin now. Thank you to everyone who took part and raised their voices. You can still join in on the action, so we'd love for you to visit our website on the digital demonstration page to learn more. I also want to give a special thanks to our charity ambassador, Nicole Smith-Holt, for her boldness to appear on 2 billboards as part of our demonstration. One of the billboards is very near Eli Lilly's headquarters in Indianapolis, where T1 International and our advocates have carried out demonstrations for the past 3 years. We're making sure that we have a presence, even if we can't be there physically as a group this year. It's also important that I reiterate T1 International's gratitude and appreciation for our volunteers and supporters who continue to organize and advocate despite the hardships they face personally and the challenges we've all faced this year. Our community's collective voice and yesterday's sessions gave me more hope, inspiration, and tools to fill my advocacy toolbox. I hope today's workshop sessions can do the same for you. I'm excited about these talks, which will cover a lot of ground, including civil disobedience, allyship, racial inequalities in diabetes care, LGBTQ+ disparities, and using your story in advocacy. Thanks again for listening and learning with us. Let's get started with day 2.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the 2020 T1 International Insulin for All workshop. My name is Eli Gerber. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the policy manager for T1 International USA. As Liz said, we really hope that you enjoyed learning from all of our speakers yesterday and that you had a chance to participate in the digital demonstration. You can visit the link that is in the chat box for everything that you'll need to participate and demand accountability from the pharmaceutical corporations that are exploiting patients for their own profit. Before we start the day, we'd just like to reiterate some of the Zoom housekeeping notes from yesterday. For today's sessions, unless otherwise noted, we will not be using the chat feature. On your screen, you will see the live Q&A button, which is where you can enter your questions for those sessions that will be hosting a Q&A. Questions will only be seen by our T1I team, and we'll do our best to address them as we're able. We're an open, welcoming community, and we ask that all participants are respectful and kind with any questions that they ask our speakers today. We also have an option for live captioning. In the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a red live button and a drop-down menu that says view stream on custom live streaming service. This will open a live transcript of the sessions today. Our first speaker is Fran Quigley. Fran is a clinical professor at the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law and coordinates the advocacy group Faith in Healthcare. Fran is a longtime human rights activist and writer, having written articles and books on access to healthcare as a human right, not to mention that he is a T1 International USA trustee. He's with us today to talk about the history of civil disobedience. Fran, welcome.
Thank you, Eli. It's great to be here. I think, can folks hear me? Good, good. Thank you, Eli. Thank you to Elizabeth for kicking us off. And I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk about civil disobedience with this group of activists who I have said to many people over many years of being an ally of T1 International and the Insulin for All movement, is really, you all are really the spirit of civil rights and human rights advocacy in this country. You embody it as much or more so than anyone in this country and beyond. And so it's a real honor to have this conversation with you. So this conversation actually about civil disobedience arises in part out of a dramatic event that happened at last year's event, when we were blessed to be able to meet live and in person. And that was that Nicole, who you've already heard from, and I think folks here already know, herself was arrested by law enforcement in Indianapolis, protesting in front of the Eli Lilly and Company headquarters. And that was certainly a dramatic event, and something that led to some questions and just an opportunity to discuss the bigger picture of civil disobedience. And for me, for a background, just briefly, I have had the privilege of teaching about social movements, including civil disobedience, to law students here where I work at Indiana University McKinney School of Law. I've been a lawyer for persons who've been committed civil disobedience, and I myself have been arrested in civil disobedience myself. So let me go ahead and make a couple of foundational points to begin. And that is, number one is civil disobedience is really dramatic. Civil disobedience can be enormously impactful, but it is just one tool in the advocacy toolbox that Elizabeth referred to. It is a dramatic tool. It is one that people pay a lot of attention to, but it is just one possible way of moving forward a social movement like the Insulin for All movement. And it is oftentimes not the right tool, just to be clear. And it's frankly, in many cases, not the right tool because core activists are not in a position to endure arrest and risk imprisonment. And that, of course, I don't need to tell folks on this workshop, that includes persons with type 1 diabetes, because insulin access while in custody can be so problematic. So just wanted to give a little context there. And in the bigger picture context here is the idea of where civil disobedience fits in the course of a social movement. And that is that this is a chart that we share when we teach about social movements in the classroom, and it comes from a famous mapping of the process of a successful social movement by an activist and scholar named Bill Moyer, M-O-Y-E-R, not Bill Moyers, the video journalist, but Bill Moyer without an S on it. And you see there's 8 stages in his calculation, which a lot of folks subscribe to, of social movement success. And a lot of this is going to look really familiar to all of you, because proving the failure of official institutions and ripening conditions you see there in 2 and 3 and 6 majority public opinion, it is really reflecting the time that you already spend, that grind, that slow month-to-month, year-to-year grind of researching the issues, of advocating to lawmakers and advocating to the public and reaching out via media and social media, et cetera, to raise awareness about the challenge of in this case, access to insulin for all. That's where real social movement success happens. But stage 4, which I've highlighted here on the screen, that's the dramatic time. That's the time where people get in the streets. That's the time where headlines are made. That's the time where the media pays attention. And oftentimes that is where civil disobedience occurs. And civil disobedience, again, can be incredibly dramatic, can be really exciting, but it's usually not where the movement is won. It's usually just, again, this is only halfway through the process, and oftentimes is followed by a kind of a down period. We're like, oh, why isn't the media covering us as much anymore? Where are the TV cameras? Where's this dramatic event? But it gets back to this grind that you all do so wonderfully every day in research and advocacy. So I just want to put it again in context about where civil disobedience fits in a social movement. And let me just take a half step back and say, I have 20 minutes in the schedule, which is wonderful that we're moving things quickly. Hopefully I will stop my yapping with enough time to do a little bit of Q&A if we get done in time. But also happy to respond to questions, and I can make sure that my email address, let me just go ahead and say it orally, fwquigley, Q-U-I-G-L-E-Y @gmail.com. Happy to respond to questions and share any of this information afterwards as well. So in terms of civil disobedience in the United States, the history dates back, at least in use of the term, to Henry David Thoreau, you may have heard of, on Walden Pond, etc. Henry David Thoreau in the mid-19th century went to jail committing civil disobedience and ended up writing an essay about it on civil disobedience. His civil disobedience was he would refuse to pay his taxes because the taxes were going to support both slavery and the Mexican-American War, which he objected to. That's pretty common, is a pretty common form of civil disobedience, is refusing to cooperate with the government by refusing to pay taxes to support unjust, immoral actions. Depending on how you define civil disobedience, if you say it can't include even violence to property, the Boston Tea Party could be considered one of the first American acts of civil disobedience. Again, incredibly profound, influential actions. One of the fundamental precepts of civil disobedience is that the foundation of it is that there are a lot of enormously unjust and immoral practices now and in the past that are completely legal. Slavery was legal. Segregation was legal. Jim Crow laws were legal. Blocking women from the vote was completely legal. Even the Holocaust was legal. And that's, of course, not just ancient history. There are a lot of things today that are completely unjust and immoral, and most of us would think is a violation of human rights, such as charging hundreds of dollars a vial for insulin that can be manufactured for a few dollars when it is essential to folks' lives. That's legal. It's not moral. It's a violation of human rights, and civil disobedience often lifts up and highlights the disconnect between the morality and the true on the books legality that needs to be changed. And one of the most impactful and profound examples of civil disobedience in the United States history was the resistance to slavery. Again, it was fully legal. The resistance included legal forms of protest, like petitions and rallies and lobbying lawmakers, etc. But it also included, really impactfully, some illegal acts, a lot of illegal acts, like actually helping persons who were enslaved to freedom. The Underground Railroad and folks like Harriet Tubman, I mean, they broke the law. They broke the law and committed civil disobedience in order to not just address the injustice of those individuals they were trying to help escape, but also to highlight the broader injustice of slavery, which was in fact legalized at that time. There are parallels to what this movement is doing now. Folks are, I'm sure, aware of the bus tours last summer, where folks from T1 International and the Insulin for All movement actually went over the border, went to Canada, purchased the massively cheaper insulin, the same insulin, and brought it back to the United States. That was illegal. That was technically illegal. It is something that fortunately is a law that's not widely enforced, but the folks doing that were very aware that they were breaking the law. And by breaking the law, that added drama to what they were doing. It did get a lot of media attention. It did get a lot of public attention. Less of a media event is what, again, a lot of folks in this community already do, and that is to share insulin with folks who are in crisis, who need it. Again, that is not something that is technically legally allowed, but it's not something that is a law that's widely enforced. But the folks doing that, everybody I know who does it knows that they're taking some kind of risk, but they're willing to take the risk, and willing to take the risk partly because it's the right thing to do for the person they're helping, but also because it highlights the injustice of why should we have people in our communities who can't afford their insulin, who can't get access to what is necessary for their life. So let me go ahead and make the next. Yeah, civil disobedience is not, of course, a uniquely American phenomenon. I'm speaking from the U.S., and that's where I do my teaching. So that's a lot of what I'm most aware of. But the civil rights movement, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the United States' really signature civil disobedience social movement. But the impetus for it and the structure, especially the nonviolent aspect of the civil rights movement, came from Mahatma Gandhi and from the very successful resistance to colonialism in India and beyond. For example, in the Salt March, Gandhi marched to the sea and it very symbolically manufactured or made a little bit of salt. Well, that was symbolism, but it was also very tangible in that the people of India needed salt. It was being monopolized and priced at an enormous level by colonizers and by profiteers, and his actions broke the law. His actions led to him eventually being arrested and imprisoned but it absolutely, for the world and for his community, highlighted the injustice of what was technically legal and changed the law, changed the society. The civil rights movement, folks are aware of the massive amount of civil disobedience that occurred in the civil rights movement. But what a lot of folks don't know is that what was conducted and coordinated by the leaders of the civil rights movement were sometimes not the most impactful forms of civil disobedience. The lunch counters being segregated in places like Greensboro, South Carolina, and in Nashville, Tennessee, that was done by young people, by college students, and it was done almost in a spontaneous way. And they obviously were incredibly brave. They endured abuse, they endured beatings, they endured arrest. But in so doing, throughout the civil rights movement, those arrests, those imprisonments lifted up the unjust nature of segregation laws and discrimination, legalized discrimination across the United States. Dr. King's maybe most impactful writing of all time, not coincidentally, was his letter from a Birmingham jail where he had been arrested for civil disobedience. He wrote the letter in the margins of a newspaper and smuggled out by his visiting lawyers. And the fact that he was so willing to endure this personal sacrifice gave enormous resonance to his message and to the entire movement. And the movement succeeded in significant part because the voluntary suffering and the civil disobedience being committed by the activists led to the moral question, the moral tragedy of racism being lifted up and forcing lawmakers to act. And the movement, I think that's really important for us to remember, and was highlighted in last year's workshop by Greg Gonzalez being the keynote speaker. Greg was a member of ACT UP, and the ACT UP movement, which was pushing for access to HIV/AIDS medicines, has enormous resonance and enormous parallels to the Insulin for All movement and T1 International, of course, because it was a patient-led movement, because it was focused on access to medicines, that without that medicines, people would suffer and people would die. And there's terrific resources out there. Fortunately, the folks who were activists in that movement, many of whom are still with us, like Greg, there's a terrific book and film out there called How to Survive a Plague about this movement. And this quote here that I have on the screen is from one of those activists saying that, again, who's living a healthy life today, if I didn't get arrested then, I wouldn't be alive today. So that movement, civil disobedience, was a core component of it. Again, lifted up the injustice that was being perpetrated on persons who needed medicines to survive, while corporations and folks were profiteering from those very same medicines. So the time I want to be sensitive to, that we're about running out. Let me just conclude by saying this. The book on civil disobedience, of course, is continuing to be written. It's a part of the Black Lives Movement. It's a part of the environmental movement. It's a part of the access to healthcare movement. And it is for folks who are leaders of the access to insulin movement and T1 International and all of you in your individual chapters to decide whether civil disobedience is one of the tools in your toolbox. But just know that it, again, is one particular prospect for social movements. It can be enormously impactful if it is chosen at the right time, and persons, of course, can continue to keep themselves safe in the process. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I think that I have used up the time, but Eli, you can advise whether there's time for questions. If not, I can take a look at, happily to respond to email questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have about 5 minutes here. So the first question that we've got is just more about how civil disobedience acts are planned, or civil disobedience actions are planned, and they don't just arise spontaneously or randomly, as you said. So can you talk a little bit about what goes into the planning process?
Sure, that varies. It's a great question. It varies, and just to lift up the curtain a little bit on what happened last year. For an example, when Nicole was arrested, the police in Indianapolis knew she was going to commit this act of civil disobedience. And I will say that as an attorney here in Indianapolis, I did help coordinate those discussions. Oftentimes, civil disobedience is very planned. It is almost always a good idea if you want to preserve the safety of the persons who are committing the act to coordinate with law enforcement in advance. That's not always the case. And sometimes activists don't want to do that. Sometimes they are willing to, and the danger and frankly the possible chaos of arrests and illegal acts committed when law enforcement is not advised in advance is something that activists want to do. That's dangerous. It's dangerous. And again, I know folks who have done that, who have done unplanned civil disobedience, and they spend a long time in jail sometimes. And if they have conditions where they need to get access to medicines and care, that's literally life risking. So as a lawyer, I will say that that's not the way that I would prefer to have it happen. I think folks in law enforcement would say that as well. But sometimes that's the way these things occur, and they definitely do raise up the drama. And sometimes getting drama is part of the goal of civil disobedience action.
Got it. Thank you. Our next question is from Michelle, who's asking if you were able to speak at all to the specific legalities around mailing insulin across borders. So, for example, from Canada to the United States.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to speak with great expertise on it, but I think that two safe statements to make is that technically this is technically at least questionable legality is point number one. Point number two is that I have never known of or heard of or have any reason to believe that anyone has ever faced arrest or criminal charges for doing so. I think those are the 2 points I would make.
Got it. Thank you. I think we have time for probably 2 more questions here. The next one is from Annika, who's asking if you can speak more about diabetes care in police custody or any resources available to help people with diabetes make the calculation of whether or how to engage in civil disobedience safely. She says that she wasn't really able to find any tips or discussion about protesting with diabetes or other chronic conditions during the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this summer. Yeah, I will say this, is that the fact that Nicole committed her act of civil disobedience here in Indianapolis, and I happen to be a lawyer who's practiced law in this town a long time, was a real advantage because law enforcement is a very local activity. And so, and I think, to be honest, I really think that it's not advisable for persons who are insulin dependent to be risking arrest in almost any setting. But if that's the case, I would strongly advise reaching out to law enforcement in advance. Say, we're going to do this. We're going to need access to insulin. Can I keep it on me? Which probably the answer is going to be no. Can I make sure I have access to it? But even with their assurances, that is no guarantee. But it is civil disobedience is, in my mind, if you want to be safe, which I think is got to be paramount, has to be at least somewhat in coordination with law enforcement. Doesn't mean you're not going to get arrested. Doesn't mean you're not going to face criminal charges. Doesn't mean it's risk-free. But that's the way that it is most often done. Thanks. And then our final question is going to be from Jessica, who says that she herself is a law student, and one of her professors has been writing about the idea that lawyers have a duty to break the law via civil disobedience and other similar actions. And she's asking how you would suggest balancing the desire to engage in civil disobedience with professional responsibility in all professions, not just in law. Yeah, it's a real question, and I certainly know a lot of folks in our profession, lawyers and law students, who would like to commit civil disobedience and do not. I have. But frankly, I have, as a privileged white male who has a job that is not going to fire me for doing that. And I was willing to deal with the professional responsibility. I have a lot of students who are Black students, law students, who this summer were really in a great deal of emotional pain because they decided they should not go risk arrest because they were worried it was going to be something to prevent them from being admitted to the bar. In my thinking, it shouldn't be, and my thinking there'd be a process for any of us to persuade and to present to our licensing bodies that we shouldn't be sanctioned for committing a just act, even if it's technically illegal. That's easy for me to say. I made my choice from a place of privilege that, frankly, young Black students and even young folks who have not yet been admitted to the bar, that's a tough place to play. Let me just say one thing is there's a whole lot that law students and lawyers can do to support
civil disobedience actions without being the ones arrested. There's an enormous need for legal observers and for folks to advocate before and after arrest. And oftentimes, we can do our best work without being the ones in handcuffs.
Thank you so much, Fran. We have some folks expressing gratitude in the Q&A for your talk. I know that we appreciate your time quite a bit. I learned a lot, so thank you so much for joining us today.
My privilege. Thank you all for everything you do every day. It's inspiring to all of us, and you're changing the world. Thank you all very much.
So in the vein of how to, have good actions and work to make change together as a movement, our next speaker is going to be Fiona Mason, who is the new National Director of T1 International USA. So in the vein of the long and rich tradition of protest against injustice, oftentimes the community that is experiencing the injustice is the leader, and then there are those of us who don't have type 1 diabetes, for example, who want to be in support as allies. So Fiona is a social worker whose roles have intersected with a wide range of social justice issues, from homelessness to immigration to human trafficking, and she'll be speaking with us today about how to be a good ally in the movement. Nice to see you on a weekend, Fiona.
Thank you. It is great to be here. And so thanks, Eli, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be part of the T1 International team and community of advocates, and feel grateful for the opportunity and the privilege of growing in my role in building allyship within the diabetes community, since I'm not a patient. I understand that hiring me for the role for National Director as someone who isn't a patient was a risk, and that the T1, especially since the T1 team, whose very mission asserts being led and centered by patients, is so centered to the work. And so, as such, I take the responsibility of centering the voices of people living with diabetes in the Insulin for All movement seriously. And so we wanted to use this time to think through how we can all increase our allyship together. Since we all hold multiple identities, it's important to learn and practice being allies, or accomplices, or co-conspirators, but a little bit more about that later. And especially imperative for those of us white folks to ensure we are centering equity within the Insulin for All movement. And today, when we say equity, it refers to the fair treatment of all people, taking into account individual needs and differences, such as gaps in opportunity. This is different from equality, which refers to the same treatment of all people, with no accounting for individual needs or differences. The former often refers to the just and fair provision of resources to each individual, and the latter denotes the provision of the same resources to all people. Though there doesn't yet exist much data to show disparities within patients living with diabetes, we know through listening to the community that there are very clear disparities, especially based on race, gender, identity, and expression, to name a few, and that the experience of people who hold these identities intersect with their experience of living with type 1 diabetes. Kevin Wren, our Washington chapter leader, talked about this yesterday in his overview of work that's happening in the US, and we've all had a chance, and we'll all have a chance to hear, feel, and better understand the impact of those intersections and what they're like in the next 2 sessions. And so, although the data doesn't yet exist, which is a whole conversation and problem in itself, the experiences certainly still do. And there exists lots of data to show that the broad range of disparities that people of color experience, stacked on top of living with diabetes, creates additional difficulties that are systemic and most often inherently racist, including but not limited to access to healthcare and health insurance, income disparities, and distance to services. And thus, as a patient-led organization, we have to figure out how to elevate these rampant disparities and, more generally, the multitude of lived experience within the diabetes community. We have to think about how to best incorporate equity into our programming in a substantial and ongoing way to ensure that when we say insulin for all, it really is for all, regardless of race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, immigration status, or other marker of identity. It is especially true since T1 International is a white-led organization, and so we need to actively, loudly, and with accountability infuse equity into the center of our work. And so today is a very, very brief overview of how we as allies can do just that. An ally is often an overused term, and since sometimes the behaviors of allies end up doing more harm than good, we wanted to talk through the term and concept of allyship. In continuing our shared fight to ensure insulin and supplies are accessible for all, we need to grow and develop in our allyship, both within and beyond the type 1 diabetes community. And so we'll be talking through the power of language and the complicated nature of the term ally and why it's important as a concept, ways that each of us as individuals and T1 International as an organization can put these concepts into practice, and thinking through why the diabetes community needs allies, not just allies who, like me, aren't living with type 1 diabetes, but also allies within the community who hold greater privileges than others in the community, and so have more opportunities to raise up, amplify, and take risks in situations where others, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color, would be putting themselves in far more risk. An ally is defined as one that is associated with another as a helper. An ally is somebody whose personal commitment to fighting oppression and prejudice is reflected in their actions. Growing and developing in your role as an ally is really just the first baby step in each of us figuring out how to participate in social justice and engaging in our civic duty. And as I mentioned above, ally is an imperfect term. For some, it's considered too diluted, too overused and misused to be of any use. For others, it's imperfect as a term since anyone can use it, regardless of how helpful or harmful their actions may be. Ultimately, it's up to each individual and an impacted group to decide who is and isn't an ally of theirs or their community. As an example, I don't get to make the decision about whether I'm an ally to the diabetes community. Only members of the diabetes community can say whether my actions are one of an ally. I can try to offer allyship, but it's on the impacted community to accept it. Yet despite its imperfections, we are using it today to help explain a role that each of us can and should take on in our commitment to social justice. And so I want to read this explanation from Candace Reels, who is an intersectional feminist and self-love advocate and creator of Female Collective. Allyship is not a one-week performative act. It's a lifetime commitment to educating yourself, listening to constructive feedback, learning from your mistakes, doing your research, and staying aware. Next, I'm sharing this great piece by Hazel Mead. If you're not familiar with her, she's a UK-based, half English, half Sri Lankan illustrator. It's titled, "You Don't Know What's Going On in People's Lives," and illustrates the terms referenced in the last slide. Staying aware plus a lifetime commitment to educating yourself through noticing, questioning your biases, and staying curious. The piece also illustrates the intersections of both internal and external identities. The impact of those intersections are impossible to see, understand, or act upon as an ally without first building an awareness of our differences, including questioning what is real versus perceived through our own biases. I'll point out a few here. The female presenting individual wearing a headscarf, well, they might be wearing the headscarf and garb as part of their faith identity, or might choose to wear it because of their culture, either which is external presentation. As such, my mind might wander to my own connection to Islam or to friends who wear headscarves. But that's my own perception. We learn from this that her mind's focus is not about her external identity, but about living with her endometriosis, which is most often an internal presentation, just like type 1 diabetes. In this next one, the tall Black man looking at his watch communicates to me pure style. But that is my own biased perception, as what I read as impatience is named by him as his anxiety. When I look at the older woman in this one, I visibly see her hunched over stature and worry about her general well-being. She also looks a bit snippy and slow to move, and I attribute that to her visible age. But that is my own biased perception, as I learn that she is stressed out about her bus pass. Do you think the driver will let her on the bus if she can't find it? Would the answer to that question be different if she were an old Black man or a young Black trans woman? There is much to learn through this illustration in terms of questioning our individual and often biased perceptions, assumptions, and projections. It's a great visual reminder to keep ourselves curious so we can unlearn and question our biases to support our work towards thoughtful allyship. This list is from a great site I highly recommend called A Guide to Allyship, which is culled together by Amélie Lamont. She reminds us that to be an ally is to take on the struggle as your own, to transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it, to amplify voices of the oppressed before your own, to acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you, to stand up even when you feel scared, to own your own mistakes and decenter yourself, to understand that your education is up to you and no one else. And to illustrate why the word ally is complicated, author Roxane Gay, in her article from Marie Claire called On Making Black Lives Matter, she reinforces the concept in the above definition, but she detaches them from the word ally. She says, Black people do not need allies. We need people to stand up and take on the problems born of oppression as their own, without remove or distance. She goes on to say, we need people to do this even if they can't fully understand what it's like to be oppressed for their race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality, ability, class, religion, or other marker of identity. We need people to use common sense to figure out how to participate in social justice. I love that line. We need people to use common sense to figure out how to participate in social justice. One of the ways that I show up as an ally is to reflect on my own biases and privileges. And as you can see from this list, I have many. People like me who hold multiple privileges have a lot of work to do, including needing to listen, needing to practice doing my own work and not asking others to teach me, needing to respect the boundaries set by individuals who hold marginalized identities, especially those around the emotional labor of supporting the reckoning that happens when coming to terms with the white supremacist culture we all participate in, needing to relinquish space and power that comes with my layered privilege, needing to address the invisibility of white privilege and that my culture is not the normative culture, it's just the dominant one right now, needing to honor and center that the best solutions come from the individuals that are most impacted. Acknowledging my multitude of privileges is an important part of my allyship. And to be clear, as Amélie Lamont from A Guide to Allyship shares, being an ally doesn't mean you fully understand what it's like to be oppressed. It means you're taking on the struggle as your own. An individual from an underinvested community cannot easily cast away the weight of their identity or identities shaped through oppression on a whim. They carry that weight every single day, for better or for worse. An ally understands that this is a weight that they too must be willing to carry and never put down. I could give away all my money and generational resources to T1 International or to support Black Lives Matter, but I will never know or feel the weight of living with diabetes or living as a Black person in America right now. And so taking on the struggle can often start with exploring how to use our privileges to commit to taking action. So what can we do with the privileges we hold to support building equity into the Insulin for All movement? We can teach other white folks and continue to learn about the barriers to success for people living with diabetes, especially people living with diabetes who also identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, and or LGBTQ+. We can promise to listen to, amplify, and center the voices of people living with diabetes, especially people from the most marginalized, most impacted communities. For me, it's more about being more than not racist, but actively anti-racist in my role as national director by just supporting the build out of an organization and community focused on equity, inclusion, and dismantling white supremacy within work culture. Abraham X. Kendi defines anti-racist as to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist sees behaving positively or negatively, not representations of whole races. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotypes from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. Additionally, we can confront racial injustices and other injustices experienced by people living with diabetes. In light of what Jasmine and Nicole and Dr. Nagra shared during yesterday's workshop, we need to normalize asking about insulin access and mental health needs, since the level of access to insulin supplies and mental health resources and support is not something we can risk making assumptions about. Lastly, we need to move from being a mere ally to a true co-conspirator in the fight against racism and other forms of oppression, and work in collaboration with people whose daily lives are affected by systemic oppression. So what should T1 International do as a white-led organization to support equity in the movement? We need to ensure that we are accountable to people of color-led organizations and communities who are affected by but not part of the organization. We need to ensure that staff in the T1 community that are people of color are supported in seeking and sharing information around issues of internalized racist oppression and self-empowerment. Ensure that white staff and the T1 International community are supported in seeking information about issues of white privilege and supremacy. ensure regular trainings and discussions are held at the advocate, staff, and board level about dismantling white supremacy and ensuring accountability in this work. We need to think about how the organizational values and norms, both the ones that are stated and unstated, can support our commitment to centering racial equity in this work. We really need to hold each other accountable, revisit this conversation often, and I'm sure we can and should continue to brainstorm many more actions we can and should take. So, where are you at as an individual? This slide from Black Girl Dangerous blog, which I highly recommend, comes from an article called No More Allies and was written by its founder, Maya McKenzie, a Black feminist writer who challenges the usefulness of the term ally. She writes, allies care but act when convenient. Allies take little risk to their comfort and seek personal recognition for momentary action. Accomplices take on more risks and more often get in the way of oppression. They disrupt, but engagement may vary with privilege. Co-conspirators know that they are not free until everyone is free and act like it. They don't just disrupt, they build. Not episodic actions, but ever-evolving mindsets and lifestyles. They seek permission from the most oppressed and listen more than they speak. Risk is how they spend their privilege best. They don't set the agenda. They follow the marginalized. They don't want cookies, they want justice. So depending on where you're at and what commitment you're willing to take related to your allyship, these questions will of course shift. But some of the questions we are suggesting you ask yourself are, what can you do to support people living with diabetes in your community who have additional barriers for success, especially people living with diabetes who are also identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, and or LGBTQ+? What are some problems with how systems support people living with chronic health conditions, and what can we do to change those systems? How might those problems be exacerbated for people based on their race and gender identity, sexual orientation, or gender expression? How do you plan on helping the fight to end issues of insulin access and affordability, and how are access and affordability impacted by the multiple internal and external identities people hold? Additionally, how can you be actively anti-racist instead of simply not racist when thinking about what systems need to change to ensure insulin for all? How can you use anti-racist knowledge to change and progress conversations with friends, families, colleagues, and peers? How can you move from an ally to an accomplice to a co-conspirator based on where you are? How can you commit to exercising your right to vote at every single opportunity you can? And as Kristen Whitney Daniels from Connecticut, our Connecticut chapter leader, talked about yesterday, she said, how can you review where you invest your money, your time, your energy as a step in determining where to reinvest as part of your activism, including through volunteering, taking an active role in organizing, mobilizing, or marching in support of movement work as part of a public pressure campaign, through donating to causes and support businesses and organizations that are owned and or led by impacted communities. What do you want or need to learn more about? We hope this very incomplete list feels like a start to, as Roxanne Gay put, a common sense way to participate. And we still need to hold each other accountable, recognize that these questions and more importantly, these answers need to be developed by listening and amplifying impacted communities. And we need to continue to revisit these conversations, especially with our friends, family, neighbors who aren't already engaged in this work. And we need to take the highest level of risk that you can. So thank you for joining me today as we hopefully establish what we mean by the concept of allyship with all its complications, thought through ways that each of us can take action in our allyship, and thought about the rationale of why building greater allyship within and outside of the diabetes community is key to our shared success in ensuring insulin for all. We hope that this session has helped to frame the next two sessions on the very real challenges of holding multiple marginalized identities whilst living with type 1 diabetes in order to support greater understanding of our commitment to working towards centering equity in our work and not leaving anyone behind. And so now we pivot to thinking about what allyship could or should look like, to an opportunity to practice some of those skills, including a lifetime commitment to educating yourself and staying aware, and then using the anger, frustration, and disillusionment you hear about in the experience of the panelists to lead to action. I honor and thank each of the panelists for their willingness to share with us the emotional toil of trying to survive in a racist system. And I hope we can all commit to taking what we learn to better support centering equity into our Insulin for All movement. So I'll turn it over to Vivian Nabeta, who is a fabulous female founder of the Sonia Nabeta Foundation, who will be moderating the racial inequities conversation and introducing our panelists. Vivian, looking forward to listening and learning. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was a great discussion. I'm really excited to be here with you today to discuss this very important subject, racial inequities in diabetes care. Just by way of introduction, my name is Vivian Nabeta. I'm the founder of the Sonia Nabeta Foundation, a New York City-based nonprofit. I lost my sister to type 1 diabetes, and founding SNF was the natural next step to contribute to the discourse, bridge disparities, prevent premature and unnecessary deaths. So the United States has a unique history of racism that has persistent, serious, tragic consequences on health and health outcomes for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. So just very quickly, let's consider some statistics on why this session is exceedingly important. Black people die at two times the rate of white people from diabetes complications. Diabetes-related deaths rates for Black Americans between the ages of 1 to 19 are higher than any other race in the United States. Compared with whites and Hispanic diabetics, Black young adults reported the highest level of diabetes distress and lowest diabetes self-management scores based on a study that was done last year in 2019. And of course, we all know A1C, a key metric in diabetes management, which showed that the mean A1C for Black Americans is 10.7% as compared to 8.5% for white Americans. So my friends, absorb that. So of course, there are multiple determinants of health, but at the point of care, health organizations, doctors, health systems have a mandate to provide safe, effective, timely, equitable healthcare. And as we're about to find out from our wonderful panelists, this is not normally the case. Structural racism, implicit biases prevent this level of care. So here we are today with a very rich panel to discuss these inequities and disparities, not only from the health organization or point of care with your doctor, but also the adverse social determinants of health that disproportionately affect Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. So of course, without further ado, let me turn the spotlight to our panelists. Jesus, incredible immigrant story, LGBTQ activist, a champion all around. We, of course, will hear from Kylene. Everybody knows Kylene, diabetes advocate extraordinaire. And then, of course, Chelcie, a comedian that lightens the burden of the condition through comedy. So please, let me turn it over to our wonderful panelists. Please introduce yourselves and your connection to type 1 diabetes and why this subject is important to you. We can start with you, Jesus.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, so my name is Jesus Morales Sanchez, and as mentioned, I am an activist, educator. I have a multitude of hats, and I was actually a late bloomer in terms of diabetes. I was just recently diagnosed about 2 years ago. While I'm not a stranger to diabetes as a whole, my multiple people in my family, including my mom, have been living with type 2 diabetes for a very long time. I am the first one in my family to be diagnosed with type 1. So it's been a ride. It's been a learning curve. And along the way, I've been seeing even more of the connections with the other advocacy work that I've been doing, whether it is access for undocumented folks in my community, in my family, but also queer folks that are often left without a safety net in a multitude of ways. So healthcare being one of the main ones. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesus. That's wonderful. Chelcie, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, indeed. My name is Chelcie Rice. I am originally from the state of Georgia, right now residing in the state of Florida. As mentioned, I am a comedian. I'm not full-time. I began performing comedy maybe around 2000 and then incorporated the diabetes advocacy into the comedy around maybe 2012. I was a late bloomer as far as like being diagnosed. I was diagnosed when I was 25. That was around 1988, 1989. So yes, I'm showing my age. I'm 56 now. This is not dirt on my chin. And what I like to do with as far as like incorporating comedy is like just reaching out and finding the absurdity in living with this condition, and at the same time helping educate people, whether they're living with diabetes or whether they're civilians, that what it is to live with this condition. And in the past few years, I've gotten very interested in bringing more people of color into the fold, so to speak, as far as the diabetes online community, because I've attended several conferences where oftentimes I'm one of the single person of color there, or at least as far as Black people, I'm one of the few Black people there, if barely any at all. And it never quite made any sense to me because as you illustrated earlier, as far as like how many numbers of Black people are affected by diabetes, we should be at the forefront of getting information and learning how to live a quality life with this, at the same time understanding how the system works for us and oftentimes against us. And so it just seems like there's a lot of information that's being missed by us. And I wanted to take upon that responsibility myself to try and bring that information to us to get us more educated. So I'm happy to be here and happy to hopefully enlighten and spread the word.
Certainly. Thank you, Chelcie. Kylene.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kylene Redmond. A lot of people know me as Kylene Diana or Black Diabetic Girl. I got into advocacy a couple of years ago, being misdiagnosed and being a Black woman. When I went online, I didn't really see people that look like me. So it was kind of important it is important to advocate for those that look like me, because we know that when diabetes affects us all, it's not just one size fits all. So it's really important that representation matters, education matters. We all should be given the same opportunity as everyone else. And as Black people and people of color, that doesn't happen, especially to Black people. And we need to change that. So using my voice, teaming up with other people, is to make noise, to let people know that we are here. We're not just affected by type 2, we're affected by type 1, LADA, and anything else, and that we deserve the same treatment as everyone else. So that's how I joined this fight. Well, that's why I'm in this fight, because we're still fighting.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, thank you all for your wonderful introductions. As you can see, folks, we're going to have a great conversation with Kylene, Jesus, and Chelcie. So before we jump into any questions, just a quick housekeeping. The panel will be taking questions after our discussion, or perhaps even during. I'll see how to weave it in. But so please enter. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. So just go ahead and plug those questions in there, and they'll be filtered out to me somehow. So yeah, no. Now I'm curious about the audience that's here. I think we have about 82 people connected. That's a good number of people. So I'd like to ask the audience, I think we have a live poll mechanism here, Fiona, I believe. So there we go, 2 questions. I think they popped up on the screen. Do you identify as Black, Indigenous, or person of color? And if yes, have you ever experienced medical racism? Okay, so we're looking at the results. Certainly everyone, it's a mixed bag. We have more non-Black, non-Indigenous, non-people of color in the audience, which I give applaud, because this is like educational and it's very important. But for those that do, a good number of them actually experienced racism, medical racism, which is not at all surprising, because I, as an African-American, have experienced multiple times medical biases where I've had to insist to receive the right attention, where a prescription that has not been written because the assumption is I can't afford it. And of course, while that may be so, I think as a patient, one always wants to have the information. Don't disempower me. Don't deny me the right of knowing about whatever it is just because of your biases, conscious, or subconscious. So that poll was pretty telling. And I think I'm going to hand over the mic to Kylene, because I think this question that I have, the kickoff question, would be good for you. You are an advocate through your wonderful platforms on social media. Have you found that as a Black person, a Black woman, you've had to advocate for yourself to your endo, PCP, primary care physician, in a way that you would have otherwise not had to had you not been a Black woman? And if you could describe that experience.
Sure. So initially, my misdiagnosis was, they told me that I was type 2 because I was a Black woman and over the age of 18. And while that could be true, do further testing. Don't just assume that that is the case because I am a Black woman. So that was one. Another time, a previous endo who just didn't want to listen to anything that I had to say, that just assumed that because I was a Black woman, or, just a Black person in general, that I wouldn't be able to afford certain things. And that wasn't the case. I work, I have a really good job. I also, I make money. Don't assume that because of the color of my skin or my zip code that I can't afford anything. And when I started to ask questions, I got a lot of pushback. And the sad part was I had to name drop and say where I worked for the attitude to change. And you're not going to help me. So after, I name dropped and named where I worked, and then the attitude kind of changed, and it was, oh, well, I didn't think you'd be interested. Well, you didn't ask me either. I brought it up. You should not assume anything, but now I'm no longer a patient of yours. So you've lost me, and anyone that ever looks for an endo, you won't be the recommendation that I will give out. The color of my skin nor my zip code should mean anything, and unfortunately, that wasn't my case. I've been with my new endo for years now, and we don't run into any issues. He's very open. If I want to try anything, he's on board. Hey, do you want to try this? Or, if it's just really not good for me, then he'll tell me no. But I don't have those problems anymore. And I think that more people should know that you can leave. You can fire your doctor. Right. Fire them, report them, contact patient relation or office manager, whomever, let them know, but you can fire that doctor.
No, absolutely. And your stories, I've heard it multiple times in the Black community here in the U.S. I mean, it's ubiquitous. And I think that's why, Chelcie, perhaps, today your post just a couple of hours ago on social media, on Instagram, you said, as Black people, we need to do for ourselves. Now, have you experienced something similar? What's been your experience? Has it been similar to Kylene's? And as a Black man, have you had to advocate for yourself just because you are a Black man? And describe your experience.
I think what I need to do is kind of paint a picture as far as my experience. Okay, now going back to when I was first diagnosed, and it was kind of a weird thing how it happened. My roommate at the time saw me having the symptoms and whatever, and he set up an appointment with a urologist because I was going to the bathroom a lot. So I go to the urologist for this appointment, and he basically, had me do the urine sample, all this kind of stuff. And he comes back and says, well, you've got diabetes. We're going to put you in the hospital for a few days, blah, 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 bling, that was it. Now, looking back at that, I can wonder, okay, now, why was he so nonchalant about this? Right. Why didn't he give me any more, information as to what I needed to do and what, see any more education on his part. I know I was going to the hospital to get educated, but why couldn't he give me some more information? So I can look back on that and say, I wonder.
Right.
Now, let's keep going forward and look at it this way. This is what people of color, I think, have to deal with on a daily basis, whether you're going to the doctor or whether you're going to the grocery store. And especially if you've never lived in the South, you get to understand exactly what systemic racism is and what covert racism, how it works. Because what happens is you end up hindsighting yourself every time something happens.
Sure.
If somebody looked at you funny at the bank when you were trying to cash a check or something or do a transaction, if they didn't really give you the attention that you saw was given to a previous customer, you have to ask yourself, well, I wonder if that had anything to do with me being Black. And that's what Black people and people of color carry around from day to day when everyday situations. I got to ask myself whether my neighbor is like looking at me funny because I'm Black.
Yeah.
And that she hasn't had a Black neighbor before. I don't know. So bringing it back to the healthcare, is like, I don't know whether these guys are actually treating me differently or not. And because the reality is, the thing about racism and accusing someone of being racist, is the only way you're going to get any kind of satisfaction is if you prove it.
Right.
That's the hurdle, is proving it. You can sit up there and call somebody a racist all you want to, but they can say, well, no, I didn't. I don't see color.
Which is the worst response in the first place.
That's as classic as Shakespeare itself.
Right.
So this is the burden where marginalized people have to deal with from day to day. If you're a woman, if a man gets served before you, and then how then they treat you differently. Are they treating, because you hear it all the time when some women go to Pep Boys or something, get their cars serviced, they get treated differently than men.
Right. What you're narrating, Chelcie, I'm reading this book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. I think it's just like trending right now, by Isabel Wilkerson. And one of the things that she states in there is like, African Americans, Black people live with chronic stress, consciously or subconsciously, just trying to survive. I mean, those little things where you're just like, how do I position myself? Is it because of race and they did that? You're just constantly managing this Blackness that is in front of you. And so this has a direct impact on health. So it's very hard already. We just don't need additional barriers to access good and equitable healthcare. So I hear you loud and clear. And
this other level that sometimes you don't think about. Say if you're at the doctor's office and there's a Black person ahead of you, Black woman, Black man, whatever. He's maybe going off, getting angry because of something he didn't understand, or he might be not moving as fast to sign out or whatever. And you see the receptionist giving him just very little attention, or just blowing him off, whatever, or she may get frustrated or whatever. You see that, and you think in your head, this is something else that we deal with. We start thinking about, okay, now I got to be on my P's and Q's so she doesn't think that I'm acting like him.
Right.
This is the reality.
Yeah.
This is the reality, because we all know you've got to call the phone company or the gas company and put on your uptight voice just so you can get some service.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, the burden is sometimes undescribable, and I think what the Black population experiences is mirrored in the Hispanic community, as Jesus is going to speak about, when it comes to sort of ethnicity, language discrimination. I know, Jesus, you and I have spoken a lot about your immigrant experience and undocumented sort of relatives and all of that, and the barriers you've experienced accessing healthcare and receiving equitable care just based on culture and language. So more generally, can you describe your experience? So just to shed some light on that other side of your...
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I'm really glad that we did that poll at the beginning, because like, I always like to preface any kind of like workshop and whatnot, just by addressing the white folks in the room. Like, hey, like, I'm about to make you real uncomfortable right now. and I need you to sit in that discomfort because I need you to learn from that discomfort. That discomfort is the teaching zone. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable to the point that you feel your safety threatened. And, but I do need you to feel uncomfortable so that we can together unlearn from these awful, awful disease that we're experiencing, which is white supremacy. There's no other way to put it around it. So with that preface in mind, yes, so it's interesting that you mentioned that it mirrors, like all these experiences mirror in the like Latino community, which is absolutely true. Like we add on to another layer when there's a language discrimination, right? And that's one of the main examples in which we encounter racism at the doctor's office for the Latinx community. It is not always like necessarily the, it is the lack of attention of a doctor's office to really ensure that a patient is aware of what is going on, that they're receiving and understanding the information for their health. And if there's a language barrier, that barrier is overcome or is removed entirely. Now, a lot of hospitals, a lot of doctors' offices right now are bringing in medical interpreters, they're bringing interpreting lines, phone lines. However, it is a work in progress that's still not quite there yet. And it's having very tangible effects on the outcome of health of people within the Latino community. Now, when we move on further from like the interpersonal relationships, then we also can see that even if we have the best meaning doctor that is really going up and beyond to address the health of their Hispanic patients, then we face these other barriers that are from the system that we're working within, right? So it is not only just, it's not just about like doctor looking at, you know, like looking funny at people or like having like this word or, you know, having a different way of wording things, but also like looking at the overall system that we're trying to navigate and understand that it all comes down from that same, you know, narrative. It's white supremacy, these systems that are put in place to make it nearly impossible to navigate for people that are do not look a certain way, that do not have a certain background. Right. I explained a couple of minutes ago, I'm newly diagnosed. I was diagnosed at age 23. I was like 2 weeks short from being 24th. So happy birthday to me. And I have a college education. I went to college, have not received my degree yet, but that's a whole other story. Right. But I know how to like work the system, right? And it still took months for me to be able to jump over different hurdles and barriers so that I could receive the adequate care that I needed. And I depended on charity systems, and I depended on all these other things that a person should not depend on so that they can save their life. So.
Yeah. No, I, you know, as Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, it is incumbent on us to come prepared, come correct, come knowledgeable, because institutions won't naturally do that for us. So be your biggest advocate. Unfortunately, it's what it is. And the relationship with, the relationship with your doctor is not working, like Kylene said, you know, you keep on stepping, you know, so that's very insightful. So Kylene, I'm gonna come back to you and, you know, let's talk about research and clinical trials. And the reason I'm bringing this up, you know, is because COVID is happening. And we also have sort of, you know, history, Tuskegee Men, Henrietta Lacks. There's a long history of, you know, with Black people and these trials, but they are important. So with that understanding, have you ever been approached to participate in a clinical trial? Would you? What would make you comfortable? What can R&D orgs do to get us comfortable, do you think?
So I have been approached. I don't think that it's because of, I believe that, well, I know that I've been approached because of where I work. I work in healthcare. So of course I've been approached, you know, because of where I work. But outside of that organization, I have not really been approached to be a part of any clinical trials. I think that they missed the mark by not including everyone, because you can't do a clinical trial all white people and then want to push something to Black people, people of color, you know, indigenous people, because we're all different, you know, our makeup is different. And then you give me this medicine and it doesn't work, or you're now collecting data that doesn't reflect everyone. And so, you know, they definitely need to approach more people, you know, not just surveys. Like, I get approached for surveys, but that's it. You know, you need to reach out to everyone else and get more people involved. Let me decide if I don't want to do it. Don't you just decide that I don't want to do something because you might have asked a few other Black people prior to me and their answer was no. Well, my answer might be yes, or tell me more about it, you know? So again, outside of work, I've never been approached, but inside of my job, I've definitely, you know, been approached and things like, you know, and from that aspect.
Right. Chelcie, that I guess a question for you also, because it's very important. Have you been approached? Would you participate? What would make you comfortable? And what really can these organizations do to get comfort, but not only that, reach Black people in a way that, you know, gives us the comfort that we need to participate in these clinical trials? Any experience there, or counsel, advice, or whatever?
Yeah, I did participate in a trial. It was some years ago when I was in Atlanta, and I think the initial reason I did it because they were paying, and so because I mean, I was all the way on the other side of Atlanta traveling to Decatur to do it. So that's like, it was like a 25-minute drive one way across town to do it. And so, but at the time, once I got into it, I started to understand the importance of it. But I can't remember how I came across that. It may have been through social media or something, because I wasn't working in healthcare. I wasn't really, like I said, it may have been through social media that maybe one of the advocates had come across it and showed it to me, and I took advantage of it.
Right.
But what I think any organization or healthcare or company or whatever that's actually doing these trials, I mean, common sense would to you reach out to where the people are. I mean, I hate to, you know, kind of mold it around the aspects of things like McDonald's or whatever. They always, because you remember back in the day, anytime McDonald's had a commercial around the time Soul Train was on, all the Black folks were dancing through McDonald's, eating cheeseburgers, all this kind of stuff, because they centered that, they aimed that towards, you know, Black people. So it just comes down to, I think for these trials, I think they need to reach out to more Black media. I mean, I don't know who took over Tom Joyner's show now, but all these different syndicated radio shows. I mean, and of course, BET wasn't what it used to be, but, you know, all these different, you know, Black forms of Black media.
Right. And even churches and places where we go and use those types of channels.
You know, HBCUs, get out there and speak to the people that you're trying to reach, and not, because that's that's the same thing I'm seeing with a lot of these diabetes conferences and stuff. Is like they aren't reaching out to the people who are most affected by diabetes, and then what happens is those folks aren't showing up.
Right.
And aren't visible. And so it would make more sense if they put more emphasis in, like you said, reach out to the churches, use the churches to try and reach those communities.
Yeah.
Because, I mean,
and maybe even put the trials like bus lines, like make it easy, make it facile, you know, because, you know, these are the things that sort of even prevent us from voting, you know, bus line, how do we get there? Kind of a thing. It completely makes sense. Jesus, I'm going to ask you this next question, just sort of moving on, just because you've talked about insurance barriers, which I don't want us to lose time, which is important in your community because, of course, undocumented folks are sometimes unable to get employee programs and all of that. So what's been the experience there? How can we advocate for them? How can they have rights for a condition like this that is so, how do we help, basically? Share your experience there.
Of course. So just for, I mean, most people, if, just a little bit quick background, most undocumented people do not have social security numbers, right? And that is one of the big requirements for accessing any kind of social program, social network, safety net program. which is a lovely talking point when the opposition talks about undocumented folks. They're coming here, they're getting free things for free. Well, the reality is that's not the case because they don't have a social security number. They cannot access it, period. This includes insurance. I often joke around saying that I was the lucky one in my family to get type 1 and to get sick, because had it been up to, if it had been any one of my undocumented family members, they would have not been able to access the same, resources that I was able to access. Mind you, those same resources were the ones that I was talking about earlier, that I had to go through hoops and loops and a ton of bureaucracy to ultimately be able to access said resource. So we see two things right there is one, actual access, period, being able to buy into an insurance, and two, like then the bureaucracy that comes afterwards to ensure that people are taken care of. There are a lot of different initiatives throughout the nation. In the state of Connecticut, which is where I'm at, there is a group called Connecticut Students for a Dream. They're the so-called dreamers. They're trying to leave that a little bit to the side because they're focusing on really bringing in a united front. And one of those united fronts is access to healthcare, allowing people to buy in to the state's Medicare programs. For Connecticut, we have Husky, which is the name of our program, and trying to get them to open it up so that people can buy into it and then people can have access to healthcare. Because otherwise, the community is relying on charity systems to treat any serious illness that comes across. These charity programs, I live specifically in New Haven, Connecticut. If you know of New Haven, Connecticut, I have an Ivy League school right in my backyard.
You have walls around Yale, so you can't even, Yeah.
Well, there's Yale, and then there's Yale New Haven Hospital. It is a matter of charity. Whatever Yale New Haven Hospital is deciding to do for charity for folks in the community, that's what it is. And if that's not working, then the person has very, very, very limited options. So
where do people find resources very quickly? And then we'll pivot to the last sort of question for all of you, where, I think people should have your contact, because that's very important information that is not necessarily published to get access to sort of insurance programs and so forth. So perhaps you can put that in the group chat. We'll get in touch with you
absolutely, I can put it in the chat. And again, and this is a state initiative. This is something that each state can try to work on and try to work with immigration rights organizations locally to push for this. Because I was in the previous session, they were talking about allyship, they were talking about co-partnership. Like, this is a good moment to put that to test and be like, hey, we need to make sure that undocumented folks have access to healthcare, because I know that access to healthcare is what's keeping me alive right now. It's what it's allowing me to have a healthy, fulfilling life where I am somewhat normal, in terms of like, I can go out and run and eat and do whatever I need to do to be happy. And
Sure.
That's something that everybody deserves.
No, I hear you. And I think that your contact would be great in the chat box for people to reach out if you're open to that. Now, I want to, in the last 10 minutes of this, what do we want to see? I always, what I worry about as, a Black person, when the George Floyd moment happens, my worry is that these conversations are fashionable right now, and they'll go out of fashion and we'll still be left holding an empty bag. So here we are. I'm trying to think about it in the ecosystem of diabetes care. We have probably 4 key stakeholders that really are our point of care sort of thing. We have the insurance folk, we have the healthcare organizations, we have outreach and advocacy people, we have R&D people, and perhaps you can have the Eli Lillys and all of that somewhere on this ecosystem. So I guess my question to all of you, all 3 of you, as we're wrapping this up is, and I'll start with you, Chelcie, what do we think healthcare organizations or any of these stakeholders, R&Ds, outreach and, advocacy groups, insurance providers can do to fix it? Because, we need to hold them accountable beyond, I'm tired of being, tokenism or lip service for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. It's not enough to put me on an Instagram wall talking about Black people. you know, I think it needs to go beyond that. What meaningful engagement is happening organization-wide, you know? So I would like to, and I think Kylene had started by mentioning representation and all of this, but exactly how, you know, if we can talk about some of the you know, our ecosystem as a diabetes community, what would we like to see? And so when we come back a year from now, we're like, oh, they did that.
Yeah, that is, to me, I think the first step as a diabetes community, especially the diabetes community members of color, and all marginalized groups we're dealing with that are affected by diabetes. Right now, we need to just sit back and just watch what happens a year from now. Because that's, and I'm speaking because that's what I'm doing. I know I haven't really said a whole lot online because, you know, I was sat in the Zoom meetings with Aaron and a couple other things. So my rationale right now is I'm going to sit back and I want to see what happens, because you know, in the past few months, we've been the pretty girls in the room. Now all of a sudden we're popular now, you know, because we got hit by the magic wand. Now all of a sudden we're Cinderella and we're beautiful. Now it's going to wait. Okay, now I want to see what happens when 12 o'clock hits.
Right.
Okay, where are you going to be when 12 o'clock hits? Now, are we going to have the same conversation next year? Are we going to have the same conversation when somebody else gets murdered?
Right.
Because that's what I got. When the whole thing happened, my email was inundated from different companies. We stand by you. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could have been standing by me 10 years ago when we were still talking about the same thing. Now all of a sudden it's in your face. Now you want to talk. Okay, well, I'm going to hold you that. So right now, I think what we need to do is start holding these folks to this and see who's going to follow through with it.
Right.
And if it comes down to the fact that they just drop the ball or they can't, then we need to work harder amongst ourselves.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, sure. And again, the burden then becomes us, again, doing the work. Kylene, I think this would be, you work for a healthcare organization. From your point of view, especially internally, like, or is there a company-wide, organization-wide strategy to focus on health inequity and Black people? Like, what are they doing that a year from now we, you know, other folks can first of all borrow from if they're even doing anything? But I really think that measurable and actionable next steps within organizations such as yours is important for accountability, because I really worry about leaving this to die out and then a year from now we're sort of having the same conversations like Chelcie said. So anything from your vantage point?
So the healthcare system that I work for, they started years ago making sure to include Black people, Hispanics, you know, people of color. They also made the seats at the table look just like the patients that we serve. Sure. So I think that that's a start across anyone's board, across organizations, health insurances, other hospitals, you know, private practices, anything. Your table needs to look like those that you serve. You cannot have an entire white table wanting to serve a Black community or people of color. You know, we can't relate. So your table needs to be able to relate to those that you want to service. That's the first thing. The second thing is get into those rural communities that you are trying to serve. You know, you can't come, I live in the DMV area. I can't come from Loudoun County, which is a predominantly white neighborhood, and want to go into the inner heart of DC and think that those people are going to listen to me. I don't look like them, you know? Well, they don't look like us, I should say. You need real people, and you need to have real people at the table when you're making decisions. You know, healthcare companies need to have patients at a table when they want to make decisions about our healthcare.
No, that's
same with hospitals. You know, we listen to our patient advocates. You know, that's what they're there for. We also need to not just talk amongst ourselves. If you are having issues with a provider, if you are having issues with a nurse, a tech, or anybody in that hospital setting or that doctor's office, contact that manager, contact patient relation. They don't want bad publicity, but they also can't fix what they don't know. And I can promise you, anytime someone tweets our healthcare system, we are on it and we are reaching to the patient and we're speaking with those providers. You will never disrespect a patient because of color or because you don't believe in that care. And we have to take that level too. You know, we have to reach out to those people and let them know what we're dealing with. Because if we're quiet about that, or we're just talking about it on a Zoom call or on social media, they might not necessarily see that information. Right. But it also, you know, it just goes back to representation, you know, having a seat at the table and discussing it, you know, holding, like Jesus said, holding those uncomfortable conversations. You know, your feelings might be hurt, but mine are hurt every day. So join the club.
Right. No, and I think that, yeah, join the club. I think your organization is something to be replicated across the board, because for me, you know, when it comes especially to healthcare organizations, it doesn't even have to be altruistic or moral for you to actually care about health inequity, because there is a business case for health equity. You know, inequity increases costs in health systems, insurers, employers, lower productivity. I mean, there's financial weights. So if you can't do it for a moral reason, you know, do it for financial reason. And I think that right there is hopefully where change will come. But we have 2 minutes. Jesus, I haven't gotten to the Q&A, guys, I know, but I would like to have Jesus 2 points, 2 minutes on basically, you know, the ecosystem. What could they do?
All right. I mean, yeah. I mean, Kylene, I think you just said it all basically. And I want to just go a little bit beyond that. It's not necessarily enough to have like a seat on the table or be participating in there, but also like who's in leadership positions, who's making decisions, has the power, and is that like the people representative of the issue affected? Is there, you know, in our case, who is leading, you know, who is really enacting like the changes that we need for our communities. Yeah. And in order for, I mean, I think the original question was like, what is like right now, what should be our goal? What should be what we are striving for in the future? I'm thinking, I'm hoping that all of I don't know how many people are online right now and listening, but I'm hoping that those 90 people that are right now online and listening, they're upholding these work, not just now, not just in the next couple of months, but continuously for the rest, because now you know. Now you cannot play the ignorance card like I didn't know, and we're telling you so that you know. Go dig into your communities, because everywhere you go, you're gonna find people that are struggling with these issues. And don't tokenize them. Don't tell them, oh, how can I help you? How can I make it better for you? It's like, what do you need? And how can I be of help?
All right, so we have 1 minute. I'm gonna do one question from the audience. Forgive me, folks. You know, this has been a hot conversation. I could go on for, you know, half a day. I think Kylene is shaking it. Yeah, we could. But look, we have one question that I think I want to throw out there, and each one of you just give me a quick answer. What actions of support would you like to see fellow Insulin for All advocates, you know, demonstrating? You know, like what, you know, action? Just one line, anything. Then we'll close. Action of support. We can also type in the box if you can't think of.
I think that it needs to be genuine. It needs to be genuine support. Don't support me if it's not genuine. You know, if you really don't stand for the change that we are asking, that we are demanding to happen, then don't pull up and ask to support me. Don't, because you're still a problem. Right. So it needs to be genuine, you know, like, and like Jesus said, you can't say you don't know. It's everywhere, you know, every other post is about something dealing with Black people and people of color. So you know it's out there. But if you're not genuine, I don't want your support.
Sounds good. Chelcie, let's have one from you and then close with Jesus, and then I'll, you know, hand over back to T1 International. Go ahead, Chelcie.
Yeah, I mean, don't be afraid to ask, for one thing. If you don't know, don't be afraid to ask. I mean, go ahead and face the uncomfortableness of just saying, look, what can I do I don't understand. Maybe start off with, I don't understand. Okay, that tells me right there, okay, well, if you don't understand, I'll ask you, do you want to understand? Then come just step into my office, we'll sit down and have a talk, and we'll help each other understand. But what I'm gonna ask for you to do after you get an understanding, you go tell somebody that you know that don't understand.
Right.
And start pushing this forward. Because, you know, I'm kind of tired of kicking up dirt myself, having to draw some attention. And the thing that I liked that I heard earlier in the conference today was about ally and an accomplice. Yeah, now I get it now, because an ally is like, you know, that's basically asking somebody, you know, hey, can you help me move? Yeah, well, let me know when you're ready. I'll help you out. Then when the time comes and they want like, oh, dude, I got something else to do today. Sit down, don't be that. I need you to show up when it's time to show up.
Absolutely. Jesus, and then I'll close.
Yes.
2 seconds.
All right, my 2 seconds. All right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that in the times that we're living right now, it's also very easy to be like caught up in like, I need to be woke. I need you to normalize like, hey, I don't understand it. I need help. I don't know. Can you help me? And giving each other grace, right? If people are genuinely, as Chelcie and Kylene were saying, give each other grace, but also with limits, because if it's something that could be easily Googled, please Google, and then come and have those conversations, because at the same time, we're getting burnt out. But if you can do some of that work yourself or come in with some groundwork, that's going to be super helpful. And more likely than not, we're still willing to have that conversation. But
yeah. No, this panel has been incredible. You know, lots of shared experiences, lots of action items for all stakeholders, including the Insulin for All advocates. So really, when can we come back to take account of what's happened since today? I mean, let's remember that today has happened. A year from now, hopefully there is a, you know, movement. So thank you all for your time. It's been wonderful, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Vivian, and thank you to all of our panelists on the Racial Inequities and Diabetes Care panel. This year has made it clear, the last few years have made it so clear that we have an incredible amount of work to do to repair the harm caused by centuries of racial and economic injustice, and that taking that into account in the fight for Insulin for All is going to be a key part of building a better future. So thank you all again for sharing your perspectives and your experiences. We appreciate you. So next, we're going to be joined by T1 International's own Diana Jones with another guided yin yoga exercise until about 10:40 Pacific time, 1:40 Eastern time. So that's a little over 5 minutes. Please feel free to take some time to do what you need to do to relax, and we'll be back at 1:40 Eastern, 10:40 Pacific for our LGBTQ plus disparities conversation. Thank you again for joining us, Diana.
Hi. All right. So just like yesterday, if you were here, before we officially begin our abridged yoga practice, we're going to stand up and make sure our legs are still there. Bend, wiggle, 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 wiggle. Yep, still there. And I would suggest that you take a walkabout, because we just talked about some pretty heavy topics. And I think it's impossible to truly digest what we've been discussing if you don't allow these topics and conversations to move throughout your body. So movement, physical movement, is also part of processing and understanding information. So I'm going to come back to sitting for the rest of my practice. So wherever you are, take a few seconds to get as comfortable as possible and focus on your breath. Let's inhale for 4 and exhale for 4. Inhale for 4 through the nose and hold for 4. Exhale for 4. One more time. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. And just like yesterday, let's take this opportunity to gift ourselves with some short stretches and yin yoga postures, all modifiable depending on your level of comfort and whether or not you choose to stand or where you are with yourself today. I'm going to remain seated, but of course, feel free to modify and change anything depending on your needs. So in this place, I invite you to awaken your senses to the sounds, smells, sights, and tastes and feelings of your surroundings. I'm going to take myself today to the Institute Woods in Princeton, New Jersey, one of my favorite green, lush places. I invite you to join me here if wildflowers and rich forests are your place to be, or go wherever it is that you need to escape to when you need time to calm and center yourself. While we're here, let's maintain gentle breaths. This time in for 3 and out for 3. In for 3 and out for 3. And just like yesterday, the stretches and movements that we're doing today are really just about lubricating the joints and creating space for energy to move between the connective tissues and muscles and fascia in the body. We're not focused on strengthening, just letting energy flow with greater ease. So let's begin with our chair, cow, and cat stretches. So feet on the floor, sits bones firmly, and let's breathe into cow. Shoulders back, and exhale into cat. Inhale to cow, and exhale to cat. If you're hearing pops and clicks, that's okay, but you don't want to overexert yourself. Inhale to cow, exhale to cat. Excellent. All right. Let's go ahead and move on to our hands raised pose. So we're going to inhale our arms up and exhale down. Inhale up, exhale down. Now we're not actually working on, creating lots of energy and fire in the body, but if it feels good to you, feel free to inhale up and exhale down with a inhale up, exhale down with a. Now this time I'm going to inhale up, and when I come down, I'm going to go all the way down to the floor and let all of the energy drip, 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 drip to the center of the earth. Inhale up and exhale down, all the way down to the floor. If your hands are touching the floor, that's great. If your hips and the sides of your torso don't allow you to do that, that's okay too. Just important to let your body hang heavy and easy, giving up your body and letting gravity have you. Let's roll up slowly. Arms all the way up and down. Inhale up. And arms back on your lap. Now it looks like we have about a minute left, so I'm going to make sure that we move on and focus a little bit more on our legs, coming into chair pigeon. So let's take our right leg, place the foot on top of your left thigh. Inhale up and lengthen your spine long over the triangle that you've created. Inhale up, spine tall, shoulders over hips, ears over shoulders. Let's extend our right foot out, back to the floor, up with the left foot, and cross that and place it on top of your right thigh. Inhale up. Lean forward over your torso, with your torso. Inhale up, stretch that leg out, place your foot on the floor. I'm gonna check in and see if I see my friend Eli on the screen. Hi, what a surprise. So thank you for joining me, and take it away, Eli.
I went to my happy place, which is Buffalo, New York, eating chicken wings. So this went beautifully. Thank you. Thanks again, Diana, for joining us. I know that in the middle of another day on Zoom, it's really great to have an opportunity to stretch, so we appreciate you. Great. So that will bring us to the next portion of our day. A quick reminder that we have an option for live captioning today. In the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a red live button and a drop-down menu that says View Stream on Custom Live Streaming Service. If you click on that, it'll give you a live transcript of today's sessions. We're joined now by T1 International's Marissa Falcon, who will be moderating the LGBTQ+ disparities conversation and introducing our panelists. Marissa, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marissa, she, her pronouns. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that this is a space built on trust and respect. Later on, we'll be taking questions from the audience in the Q&A, and any hurtful or derogatory language in that space will not be tolerated. We are here to learn and show solidarity, not to discriminate. We just heard from some amazing advocates talk about how structural racism impacts access to healthcare. We are now going to shift slightly to talk about the ways that the daily stress of being LGBTQ+ in America uniquely affects type 1 diabetes individuals. Both of our speakers today also have the experience not only of being queer, but of being trans and gender nonconforming, which, as we'll talk about in a minute, has implications both medically and personally. But first, let me introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Quinn Leighton, who uses they, them pronouns. Quinn is the Montana Insulin for All chapter leader and was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 3. Being diagnosed so young and living with the disease for 37 years, they don't really remember a time without the daily struggles of type 1 diabetes. They grew up in a rural state as a queer, non-binary person, often hiding diabetes in the background of their other identities. Their advocacy has shown up in several ways, using social media, op-eds, and videos to share their experience, from the financial burdens to specific stories about the emotional and physical burden of living with this invisible illness every day. In their spare time, they dabble in photography and enjoy reading, writing, and, per Diana's recent statement, hiking in the incredible outdoors Montana has to offer. It is very green and beautiful. Next, we have Sydnee Griffin, who uses they, them pronouns also, a non-binary queer person with type 1 diabetes, diagnosed in 2013 at 16. After spending time in the professional world, they realized how few disabled folks have a voice, especially when it comes to invisible illnesses. This inspired them to learn and speak out on these issues and how they intersect with being Black and queer. Their interests lie in race, queer, and disability politics and advocacy. They spend their spare time reading and writing. Sydnee hopes to continue to use their Instagram and writing to continue to advocate here, as well as learn about these issues. Thank you both for being here. So let's start with a little bit of framing. What is unique to the experience of having type 1 as an LGBTQ+ person? Sydnee, why don't you go first?
Unique, to having type 1 and being, LG queer plus, I guess, is all the daily struggles of diabetes, as well as some of those struggles with being queer as well. General discrimination within the people that are supposed to be your community as well. So it kind of makes everything a little bit more difficult when you have to worry about your safety as far as your health concerns, and then your safety as far as being a queer person, being out, how flamboyant you are, and things along that line.
Quinn?
I think many of my comments sort of echo that, as well as just sort of the internalization of homophobia and transphobia in the broader sense. I also work in the LGBTQ world, so I hear a lot of the ways in which queer and trans people face discrimination, bias, prejudice in accessing medical care, whether or not they have diabetes. And then just thinking about the local, state level, and federal level of what's going on that affects us, and seeing like attack after attack, and the way that we internalize that, and maybe don't take the same level of care for our diabetes, and can sort of add to more negative health outcomes and things like that, and maybe not accessing care in the same way that we would if we didn't feel that fear of discrimination or prejudice.
Yeah, thank you both. Let's get a little bit more specific. We mentioned earlier that not conforming to gender norms can have medical ramifications. What have your experiences with medical providers been? Quinn, I know you have stories you want to share, so why don't you go first?
I do. So one that I always remember was going to see a new endocrinologist here in Helena, and I stepped up to the counter, and one of the women was busy, like on the phone, actually I think on her computer. And so she asked me to step to the next receptionist over, and she said, and I don't remember that woman's name, but she said, "Can you help this?" And she sort of paused and stuttered, and I had to finish the sentence for her because she couldn't figure out my gender, which is what people go to all the time. And so I was like, I'm a person. Can you help this person? And so I literally had to finish the sentence for her. And this happens all the time in a number of settings. Like it happened in the grocery store as well. This woman couldn't figure me out. And it's just, I think people just sort of go to this like very binary sense of like where people should be and how they express themselves. And so both in terms of my gender expression and my gender identity, I get treated and mistreated in different ways in the medical setting. And so just the fact that I had to like tell her and folks in that medical setting that I'm a person, and like you could just refer to me as a person rather than, you know, whatever gender you think I am, that'd just be great if you could just call me a person. And then I've had a couple times I recently trying to advocate for changing my name in the medical file. And one was at my endocrinologist's office because they noticed that my pump, they download the pump information and it was under Quinn. And so she asked, she said, are you going by Quinn now? And I said, yes. And I said, could you change that in your file? And she was like, not until it's legally changed, and like walked out of the room. And I was just like, it was like a shot to the gut. It just sort of like reminded me of the very systematized and like colonized way that we have our medical system set up. And it's very black and white. And they weren't willing to make any change, even like a preferred name, you know, instead of calling me by my dead name, like just preferred name or a nickname. And then on the other end of that, I did it with my eye doctor, and they do have a way of putting in a preferred name. And then when the nurse told the doctor and he came in the room, he not only was supportive, but he like celebrated it. And he was like, that's so great. He was like, good for you. And it was actually, he's my favorite doctor, even though he has to often inject steroids into my eye, because it's like the worst complication of my diabetes is my left eye. But he made a point as well after I, got the injection and was getting ready to leave. And he was like, bye, Quinn. And it was like the most affirming thing that like a medical provider could do. And I wish that there were more ways that medical providers took the steps to support people instead of the burden always being on us. And it's just like, you see it a lot, especially with trans folks. I think that they're more supportive if you bring in like a partner of the same gender, people tend to be more supportive of that. But if you're trans or non-binary, gender non-conforming, just the way that you try to advocate for changes or how you are just treated as a human being can be really difficult and just emotionally exhausting.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thanks for sharing. Sydney, why don't you go next? Tell us about your experience in medical settings.
Yeah, so I have known that I've been, queer for a while, but recently just came out as non-binary within the past year. And even with that, am not out to my care team. Typically, I have enough issues with them as is, unfortunately. And I don't feel like advocating for myself in that way is my biggest priority, which is kind of a bummer. But being as someone who, presents cis woman, and as a fat Black person, I run into some issues, in my endo's office with that in itself. And, I feel like just for safety and also for my own peace of mind, I kind of have to, pick that battle and think about whether or not that's something I feel like fighting today, which is the whole issue, right? It shouldn't necessarily be something that I feel like fighting. But I didn't want to add, anything to the list where I can go in there and be treated any kind of way, being Black in Minnesota, having my hair the way it is and this, that, and the other. Like I could throw a dart and kind of pick any of these reasons as to why I'm struggling. So I didn't necessarily want to add that to it. I haven't had any issue. Like my name is still my birth name. Like I've been lucky enough in that regard, but it's really grating to be misgendered in a space that you have to be, because I don't even have the, not necessarily luxury, but the option to not go to my endo's office, to maintain prescriptions and just things like that. So in the other hand of that, I have not dealt with any of that, but I guess not is kind of the issue there as well.
Yeah, thank you. Clearly, there's still a long ways to go when you can't be your whole self safely, including in your doctor's office. So on that note, one of the things that we want to highlight both in this session and in the workshop more generally is how we as a community can better show up for each other. Where do you need us to improve our support of you and other LGBTQ plus people with type 1? Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can go first if you're cool.
Great.
So I think a lot of it is centered around language, because I know we have online community and things of that nature, and we really lean on each other when it comes to those immediate questions and support and things like that. The biggest thing that I've noticed is since getting more into the online community is the way that people phrase things and insert gender unnecessarily into it. Like I know on Instagram and Twitter and things, people will do the, whole ladies, when it's your time of the month, how do your blood sugars go and da-da-da-da-da. And I try and respond to all those people, like not everyone that has a period identifies as a lady, this, that, and the other thing. In that same vein, people do the whole, it's summertime, how do you wear a pump with a skirt? Do you put your pump in your bra? Still again with that ladies piece. Because not everyone that wears a skirt is a lady and they don't identify as such. So it's really hard to see that in the community still being further kind of like pushed to the side and having to advocate for yourself in that way. And then I know there's been a lot of issues as far as like reproductive rights and things like that, and birth control, and if you're already rationing your insulin and, struggling with complications and stuff like that, that could affect your, pregnancy in that whole way too. And the way that birth control with diabetes and with these complications is still framed around this gendered language tends to be, the biggest things that I am seeing within the community, or people, assuming your gender right off the bat when trying to be your friend, but it still kind of just leaves that negative taste in your mouth when you have to kind of other yourself, from people right off the bat.
Yeah, I think that's huge. The messaging and the language is, I feel like we could talk for hours about that. It's, having gender neutral pronouns that nobody understands is really difficult. And I think that, advocating just in general to like friends and family and trying to find that understanding can take a little bit of time, but like, in those ways, it definitely, you can see the change happening, but I have never even tried in a medical setting. I think I brought it up at my eye doctor appointment with him and his nurse because I got such positive feedback when I advocated for my name change. And because when the doctor came back in, the nurse said, she's changing. She's going by this. And I then tried to talk about pronouns, but, I don't even try sometimes because it's just so overwhelming. And you can only advocate for yourself so much before you just want to crawl inside of a hole. And it's largely around the pronouns. It's so hard. And people don't understand non-binary language that well because we've been brought up in this world and in this society that focuses on binary gender and gender norms and the way that we should fit inside these boxes. And so even as a, you know, even before I came out as non-binary, I was a gender non-conforming person. And so I did go through a process of changing my pronouns. And, but I just think that the way that sort of the medical field is set up is some clinics and some medical providers are sort of like taking on this role of like trying to get training or reaching out to LGBTQ groups and more specifically trans and non-binary led groups on like Trans 101 trainings, or like how can we modify our intake forms. And I do think that that's a big way that things could be improved. At least for me, like if I was going to a doctor's office and they were like, oh, we just want to make sure like everything's correct and just update your intake, and there was like a line for chosen name and pronoun, like that would make me feel so much better and more validated and make me feel like they were seeing me as a whole person instead of just looking at my A1C and my pump. Because largely I feel like my endocrinologist, even though we, you know, get along fine, he just looks at the numbers and he's just like, oh, I hope you win the lottery soon so you can get this great new pump. And he's just really focused on that. Even one time when I tried, like I was terrified of a low that I had where I honestly felt like I was going to die. And I tried to tell him about that. And afterwards I was like, do endocrinologists go through any sort of like social worker training? Because I just didn't, like, it was the worst response ever. And that was about a terrifying low I had. And that had nothing to do with my like humanity as a person. And so I would like, and especially after the conversation with this nurse, like I'm literally never having this conversation with their office again. But to Sydnee's point, like he's the only one in the town I live in. I have to go back and see him. He refills my prescriptions. I need to make sure that I'm doing okay. And this is the price we pay, is like, they're going to use my dead name and they're going to misgender me every single time. And it sucks. So as much like sort of advocacy around like working with medical providers and clinics, especially like the big clinics that have like all the individual doctors under like a hospital, and working to modify the way that they're like talking to patients and asking these questions. I think it seems like a little thing to people who aren't affected by it. And it is a way that people can show up for LGBTQ people. But I also think that if you're not impacted by it, like leaning on LGBTQ people and making sure that this is the leadership that they would like to see, because like we know what's best for us. So don't like go making changes and patting yourself on the back for doing things that make you feel good about doing something for us. So those are a few of my thoughts. And again, I'm sorry, I get a little like, rubbed up.
It's worth revving about, I would say. So one of the sort of key takeaways that I'm hearing is that cis people should be vocal to their doctors about including more inclusive language in their intake forms and in their processes, so that it's not always on the backs of the trans and gender nonconforming people to do it for themselves. I also just wanted to sort of note that in conversations that we had sort of before this, in preparation, a couple of things came up that I found really sort of like powerful to hear about, and so I wanted to just kind of like flag and make sure that they get spoken here too, while we have others in the room. And one of them is, we talked a little bit about inclusive language, but and that part of that is like how you talk about different types of care and different sort of like problems that might manifest in your health. But part of that also is in thinking about how and when you invite people into spaces. Yeah. And making sure that the spaces that you are inviting people in are actually for them. So if you are going to invite a trans person or a gender nonconforming person to a women's space or a male space, to make sure that that is actually a space that they will feel welcome in and is actually a safe space for them to be in. Don't know if either of you want to actually add to that.
Yeah. Well, I know there are a lot of I guess smaller groups kind of branching off within the diabetic community now to kind of like, highlight these specific issues and find solidarity within the solidarity, which I think is super great. But I think it's really important to note that not every space is for someone who looks like someone, just, to be like what you said. There have been women spaces that I've been invited to, and it's really still that lonely feeling of having to tell someone like, no, I actually don't belong here. Thank you for that. And I've, had people kind of push back and be like, no, like, it's okay. And, and things like that. And it's like, well, if it says girl in the title, this like little club, that I don't want to be in it, because I don't want to feed into that misconception that you can kind of move me here or wherever on the scale. And I don't want to be there as your token kind of like girl-esque figure. Because it just ends up making me feel bad, and I know you're trying to be helpful, but I find myself kind of, what Quinn said, having to push back on people who are well-meaning, but it would be even better if, on the front end, we could stop this before it turns up to be something else,
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, this is a big one for me. I've seen it a lot on different platforms, and actually found a pretty good article on it as well. But I see it, so I'm fairly politically engaged locally in Montana. And so I see it a lot around elections where there have like women for, this candidate. And even folks who know that I identify as non-binary still invite me to those groups. And I saw a good article both on LinkedIn and Facebook going around that talks about like the dangers and harm of like clumping groups together without like thoughtful and intentional efforts around like what that means. And for me, it's, I think because I was assigned female at birth, people still think of me as a woman. And these are, in my mind, like well-intentioned allies who aren't like thinking it through and don't realize that when they send that invitation, it's actually like again, like this small, like punch to my gut where I'm like, no, like, ugh, it pains me. And it also doesn't invite, like, are you inviting non-binary femme people? So somebody that doesn't look like me but is also non-binary, because I doubt that you are. And also, like, does your women's group, is it fully inclusive of trans women? And so it's just like being really, really careful and thoughtful about like how you're setting up these really specific groups, and just thinking about that inclusive nature and like how you're doing it. And yes, it takes some thought, but also it can be as simple as just reaching out to different groups of folks and asking for like a little bit of insight on how you do that. Because, some women's groups are great and some of them are just real bad, and they don't think that trans women are women. And that's just really dangerous and harmful to the movement.
Indeed. And the world writ large.
For sure. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. We're going to take questions from the audience in a second. Another quick reminder that we will not tolerate discrimination, but feel free to add your questions. But before you do, what is the main thing that you hope people take away from this conversation?
I think for me, I think I said some of it just sort of around like how the burden, it always feels like a burden on us to make these changes, and that many medical settings are just always focused on your specific care and like what's going on with your diabetes, and don't often like think about everything else about who you are as a person. And so I think that there's that, but for me, I think, and this is in part because of the work I do during the day, is recognizing, like, we know that living with diabetes is difficult, to say the least. There are so many challenges. We have to think about it every second of every day. Like, we're constantly checking our blood sugar. You have to think about it before you exercise, before you eat something. So there's all of those, and like, how are we able to financially stay alive? And then what I would also like people to know and think about is LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted by just about every issue. I have done a lot of work on LGBTQ youth homelessness. There is a very high rate of homelessness among youth and young adults and transgender people. I actually was at a conference and I saw a sign on the ground that said homeless and diabetic, please help. And it like broke my heart. And I was like frantically running around downtown Chicago, which I was completely unfamiliar with, like trying to find this person. And also very high rates of violence in many places. There is essentially like a patchwork system of protections for discrimination. Like, in many ways, it could be a perceived threat, but also queer and trans people can be denied service. So a physician could say, I don't want to serve you, or I don't want to provide services to you because I don't like that you're trans. And so these are things that can happen. And so sometimes it's like we get tired of being treated like crap, and so we don't want to go back to that doctor, which can be really dangerous. But in other ways, like, they could simply not provide services depending on where you live. And depending, you know, Montana is a huge state, much of it very rural, and it could be very dangerous. So I think just thinking about like both of those and how they individually, they're both very difficult, but like together, thinking about how that manifests into how we can create healthier outcomes to try to support both of those. So I think that's my, sorry, long-winded response.
Okay.
I think for me, what I'm, hoping folks take away is, even though there's plenty of stuff that makes us similar and the same, there's a lot that makes us different, even if just the few things mentioned here. And remember, I guess, how you feel talking to your maybe non-diabetic friends and family and things, and how frustrating it is to have them constantly kind of, maybe belittle what you're going through or not completely understand it. Or even, I know like part of my frustration was I had to keep telling people I ate with to say food wrappers who weren't super familiar with diabetes, right? And it just not being the biggest deal, but if you keep going through it and you keep going through it, you bring that up, makes them uncomfortable. If they cook for you, then you have to kind of take care of them and make them feel better. It's like, it's very similar in that same vein. And both of these things can be, life-threatening. So there's plenty that makes us similar, but enough that makes us different, where I might need, different or certain accommodations than you do. And it would be nice to not have to bring it up, have to get misgendered. I end up feeling bad. I have to take care of you. You apologize. Because a lot of people, when they misgender, you do the very dramatic, they either don't care or they do the like, I'm such a horrible person, please never speak to me again, da-da-da-da-da, and like it turns into a whole thing where it's like, you know what, maybe I just, shouldn't do that. So I guess just, I don't know, take a second, it's not that hard, but it ends up like sticking with you more than sticking with us more than, like Quinn said. It feels terrible and it makes you feel super invalid in a space that you're supposed to belong, right?
Yeah, and when people like overly apologize about misgendering you, then to Sydnee's point, then it almost makes you, like, us look like the bad guy for like correcting somebody or just asking them to use the right pronouns. So
yeah, it's putting the burden back on
you.
Thank you both so much. We've gotten some like really great questions in the chat, and fortunately we have some time to answer them. So I'm just going to do these in the order that they came in. The first one is, a lot of queer people express a form of body dysmorphia related to their gender or gender expression. Also, a lot of diabetic people have their own complicated relationships with their bodies. Do you find that your relationship with your body is compounded by your diabetic status and your queerness? How does that manifest to you? And how have you learned to cope, for lack of a better word? Learning to love your body is a tough journey for everyone.
Right. I know, at least for me, like, I've been experiencing a lot of dysmorphia, but when I can do well, like with my diabetes, and stay in range, that kind of makes me feel like my body's doing something right. At least even just structurally, and like, you know, hey, maybe I'm not like staying alive, I'm doing the things. So it tends to make me feel better in the ways that I can't necessarily fix, because I feel like very firmly in being non-binary, and some days I want to look like this, and some days I want to look like that. And I can't achieve that even if I did have all the necessary resources, because it goes back and forth so much. So I think even though diabetes is a pain, when I see like, oh, I've been in range for, 10, 12 hours, whatever it is, it's kind of like a little pat on the back, in that way, like the body's not completely useless.
Yeah, I definitely have and do experience body dysmorphia with being non-binary and transmasculine. I don't feel like I experience as many like body issues with my diabetes as much as I feel like I don't have any control. Like, I feel like my diabetes controls my life. And so I'll sort of compare it that way. In many ways, I feel like I don't have a lot of control over my life because of living with diabetes. And then also, as a queer and non-binary person, I feel like I can't control the way people treat me, and I can't control the ways that lawmakers and just sort of like the socio-political landscape is going to treat me. And so, like, on any given day, I could have a transphobic slur shouted at me on the street. And so in those ways, they sort of coalesce. And the way that I have dealt with that is I try to focus on the things that I can control. So I try to cook healthy meals, although that has definitely ebbed and flowed during the pandemic. But I try to cook healthy meals. I try to exercise regularly. And I am a prolific like cleaner. I like to clean the kitchen. I do the laundry. So it's like, as much as I can control like the house, those are the ways that I sort of deal with it. Because I'm like, I can't control all this other stuff. And if I focus too much on that, then the rest of it is lost. So.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'm going a little bit out of order, but I just wanted to say, we got one comment in the chats from somebody who said that, I just wanted to say that as a non-binary queer person, I really appreciate both of you speaking. And I just wanted to make sure that you both heard that before we left. So next question. How would y'all like to see the Insulin for All spaces, in addition to that already mentioned, to make it clear that LGBTQ plus community members are not only welcome, but desired? Specifically, what is missing from these spaces at this moment, and how can we be better allies to the people with diabetes and LGBTQ plus community?
Sometimes it feels still like very like tokeny. Like, there's always the big hullabaloo during like Pride in when like legislation is passed. So it'd be very nice if it could become just very streamlined into the normal, where everyone kind of has that seat at the table. There wouldn't necessarily need to be a large push to incorporate queer people because they're already there. And I feel like that's part of the issue, is that there are so often times like, we're looking for queer people, we're looking to do this and to help, and it's like, you already should, you know, and then it's what, July 1st, and then the rainbows go away, and then everything is, you know, back to the way it was. You know, so normalize it, right? Like, don't make it, I don't want to say don't make it a big deal, but kind of, right?
Yeah, I mean, tokenization is always a thing that we need to be discussing. But I think for me, I mean, this would be a bold action, but like taking it on as like part of the programming of the Insulin for All work that T1 International does is like sort of, because there's so many pieces to it. Like I said, like there's so many different like ways that people are disproportionately impacted, and visibility and representation is important. And so that would be mine, is like being able to talk about it more, and elevating LGBTQ voices of people who are living with type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And so, I mean, like I said, it's kind of a big step, and you know, having like a program takes money, I know, but yeah, that would be mine. But just being able to talk about it more, elevating issues.
Thanks. I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out what our fun last question should be, because we have a whole bunch of good ones, but I think we only have time for one more. So here's one. Quinn, you mentioned Trans 101 trainings and things like that. I'm wondering what both of you think would be important in provider education, either medical school or continuing education, to make healthcare spaces more inclusive and safer. We'll end with a big one.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is that, you know, medical providers are also people, you know, who all come with their own bias, their own implicit bias. And so part of that is just, you know, can't be helped. But I think, I mean, ideally, it'd be wonderful if there was some specific training that they went through in order to become a medical provider. Like really specific to working with LGBTQ people, and specifically like trans and non-binary people. But I also think that there are a lot of organizations that focus and specialize in this area. And so I'm sure there are organizations in every state that could work with like Insulin for All chapters and work with medical clinics, physicians on doing that training, or even just consulting with them on intake forms and things like that. Like I've actually I get those asked sometimes, and then I refer them out to our community partners, or I simply say like, these are some great ways that you could add, help people feel more valued and affirmed if you add like more than 2 genders on the form. And so I think, you know, because adding a whole new training aspect for medical providers is no small feat. And so a lot of this, you know, systemic change we know is not easy or quick. So, but I do think like folks reaching out to local LGBTQ groups in their areas, and specifically if there's one that focuses on trans issues, I think that could be one way to try to get the ball rolling and see. In Montana, there are more folks who want this training. You know, some don't care to get it, but there are some who are like, I just don't know how to provide the right treatments to transgender people. It's not that I don't want to, I don't want to do it wrong. So.
I think for me, I noticed a very drastic difference in the care I received with my pediatric endo to my adult endo, and even my pediatric endo having her own issues. I feel like, at least for me, I don't know if anyone can echo this, like as soon as you make that switch, like Quinn was saying, the care is very much about your numbers, about your, your pump, about your this, and there's not necessarily that connection made between patient and doctor. And it sounds really cheesy in that way, but I feel like even like the best teachers know their students, and that kind of cuts down on the issues and the possibilities of misgendering. And every person that I have come out to, and every person that knows my pronouns and things like that, is a friend or someone I trust. And obviously I'm not trying to BFF with my doctor. But if I felt like I wasn't going to get turned away or, laughed at or even told no, even like what Quinn said, then I'd be more apt to do it. And I think you need to build that relationship with your patients and earn that trust, which once again is not an easy thing to do if you see, if you're a large practice or whatever it is. But I've had doctors introduce themselves to me each time that I see them, when it's like, I know who you are. I feel like a simple glance in my chart could tell you who I am. Things like that, where it's like, okay, so you don't even, not that you don't recognize me, you don't know me, you didn't look ahead of time. Why would I waste my time trying to, come out or be like this, that, and the other kind of whatever it is. So yeah, like people are not making people feel comfortable. I think that's part of it. On a smaller scale would be a little easier,
Yeah. We have 3 more minutes, so I'm going to take it back and do one more question, which is I think a nice little closing out question, which is how did you get started, each of you, with your activism work, and how do you incorporate LGBT and diabetes activism together?
Well, I know for me, I think, and Quinn, stop me if I'm overstepping, I feel like when you are part of a quote marginalized group, and as soon as you kind of hit that, like, oh, I know, you always try and incorporate that into your day-to-day, and you have really no other choice but to advocate. I mean, you do, but like the right choice, right? So obviously being Black my whole life was part of it, and then identifying as queer, and then formerly seeing myself as a woman, you kind of hit all those groups that are suffering in kind of the underrepresented. And then that kind of snowballs and transitions, and then you get like another one, and that's diabetes, and then it becomes just so much day to day. And I think being vocal is advocacy in itself. Like living your truth and just telling people like, hey, I don't want to be called that, and standing up for yourself is part of it. You don't even necessarily need to do the whole get on this platform and do this, that, and the other. So I think, living your truth and then reading, learning, meeting people, it kind of, it fits together in a good way. It'll happen. I feel like it's not as big of a search and find thing as folks make it out to be. Quinn, I don't know if you'd say the same.
No, I agree. I mean, I think I joke with people that I feel like a walking coming out poster, that like people aren't going to see me and think I'm straight or like married to a man. So, I mean, a lot of my queer advocacy, despite the job I have, is because I am who I am. And, even my past employment experience, I've always just wanted to do work that felt rewarding and fulfilling and like trying to right a wrong. And so I think, and especially as issues impact me as a person, that's kind of when it propels me even more. And I definitely don't hide that I have diabetic privilege. Like my employer provides great health insurance, and I have a pump, and my care is manageable. But I think that that's also when you do have privilege, it's also just even more important that you use that to advocate for folks who might not be able to advocate for themselves. And so, or feel safe to do so. So I've been doing LGBTQ advocacy for 10 years, and diabetes advocacy probably 5 to 7 years in different forms, whether it was sharing my story, doing it doing it for political advocacy, I'm often leaned on for doing a message for candidates and things like that. But yeah, just sort of in different ways. And then, obviously understanding that just sort of the intersections of how all of these identities overlap and how the barriers to economic self-sufficiency is just really important, and you need to be talking about all of that. And I think about this a lot, just sort of in my day job, where it gets really exhausting having to constantly justify our humanity in fighting bad bills. And I think about that with this work too, where it's like we have to justify that we deserve affordable insulin. And like, what would the world look like if both as a queer and trans person and somebody living with diabetes, what if we could just pay $10 for a vial of insulin and people didn't try to discriminate against us, and we could like celebrate our humanity, right, across the board? Like, what if that were our reality? And so that's why I think it's so important to advocate and fight for what's right and what we just deserve as people.
Yeah, I think that's the world that we are all hoping for. So that's all we have time for today. Thanks to everyone for joining us, for submitting questions, and talking about how we can all show up to each other. And a special thanks to Quinn and Sydnee for offering their voices, their time, and their vulnerability. We appreciate both of you. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marissa, for facilitating, and to Quinn and Sydnee for sharing. Living with diabetes poses a lot of challenges all on its own, but when it intersects with issues like bias, discrimination, or mistreatment, it makes it that much harder. And I want to especially thank both of you for kind of closing on that note of, what could be, what the world could look like, what we can achieve if we, truly work to bring inclusivity and justice to all the spaces that we're a part of. So thank you, both of you. Next up, we've got Chelcie Chism-Vargas with us to talk about storytelling for social change. Chelcie is a first-generation Peruvian American who lives in Des Moines, Iowa, where she's passionately involved and committed to political and community organizing. Chelcie is a storyteller and patient advocate who knows firsthand how storytelling creates social change and finds solidarity in sharing this knowledge with others to advance human rights. Chelcie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, y'all. Yes, my name is Chelcie Chism-Vargas, and I am going to be screen sharing. So give me just a moment here. And my name is Chelcie Chism-Vargas. My pronouns are she, her, ella in Spanish, and I'm here to talk to folks about storytelling for social change. Kind of sounds like a big topic, so let's dive in a little bit here. And I just want to say I was able to hear the last conversation, so I'm excited to be a part of this just because this is a lot of great content, so thank you for having me. So storytelling for social change. Well, kind of like why storytelling is a big part of this, right? Storytelling is super important, and it's something that we do all the time on a day-to-day basis. It's something that many of us perhaps grew up with. Right? Storytelling really is tradition. Storytelling often happens for entertainment purposes, right? To get folks excited about something or to tell them a series of events. Also though, storytelling is really utilized to transfer knowledge as well. So sometimes we'll tell each other messages via stories, either messages to protect one another or to inspire one another. But it's really, there's a lot of information in storytelling. So this is one big reason that storytelling is effective. It helps us transfer knowledge in a way that keeps people engaged and keeps people excited. But storytelling does a lot more than that too, right? If we think about some of our favorite stories, I immediately think back to childhood stories, but they invoke emotions in us, right? Whether something was scary or something, like I mentioned, was inspiring, it causes us to have these feelings through the story. And those feelings, they don't just invoke feelings, but they then invoke values. They invoke things that we care about, things that we think are important when we hear a story. And when we're able to have these kind of community sense of values, right, this social understanding of being rooted in very similar values, that causes us to have connections with people. It really helps us realize that we're not in this alone, that other people feel how we feel from our emotions, that they're grounded in those same values, and it causes us to really create solidarity with one another. Storytelling as well, though, if you think of really any story, stories have a clear challenge, right? Something that happened, or something that someone was going through. And then a choice is made, right? There's usually that moment in a story where the individual who's the main focus of the story makes a choice, right? Maybe they made a bold decision, maybe they were brave. And then outside of that choice, we see an outcome. What was a result of the challenges that they were going through and the choice they made to get us where we are? So storytelling is an amazing tool for advocacy, and an amazing tool to connect with a wide audience. It's something that I personally have found super, super valuable to my work. I do sexual and reproductive health organizing, so very similar health advocacy, and being able to tell our own stories, control our own narratives when perhaps the public is saying something else, really allows us, like I mentioned, to control our narrative and get our message out there directly from us. So storytelling is an incredible tool, and we'll dive into it even more. So when we say storytelling for social change, why social change? Why do we want to create things? Why do we want to create a change socially? Well, if we can raise an awareness for something, right, via our story and get those people to feel those values, we can cause them to take action. We can really be what causes them to say, hey, you know, enough is enough, or I want to get involved. And if we can do that with enough people, we can create the social change we need. So a few points here. We need to raise an awareness on our unique healthcare experiences. This is something that's super important as we're thinking about healthcare, because all of our healthcare experiences are very individual, right? No one's story is the same. So creating an awareness about how unique our experiences are, especially in healthcare, allows people to better understand this big, huge system, which seems really intimidating and it has so many barriers. And as well as those who are most impacted, right? You should be at the center of this work. You should be the one telling your story to then create that social change. It wouldn't make sense to have someone who wasn't a type 1 diabetic to be leading on type 1 diabetic issues because they're not as familiar with the issue, right? So we want to make sure that when we're doing social change, that the ones who are leading the social change are the ones that are closest to the issues because they're the experts, right? That brings us to our next point. You are the expert and you have a keen understanding of how to address these issues. So the resolutions, the changes, they should come from those who are directly impacted. Also, it helps us support ourselves, right? It helps us create that advocacy and invites others to join in on us, but it's not just for us, right? We don't storytell just for our own self. Although we do, it's very important to be your strongest self-advocate, but we also do it for the good of others. We do it because we understand this is a social issue, that although we do have that unique experiences, there are many other people with just as unique experiences, and we need to all support each other and move forward together. So that's why storytelling and social change, right? Telling your story in this public setting or thinking beyond yourself and thinking for a movement is super effective, especially when you're connecting with people's values. So when we're saying storytelling for social change, what that also means is creating a public narrative. That kind of sounds like a big title, but it's quite simple. As you see, there's a little graph here that has the self, the us, and the now. And so it kind of brings people along the way with us. So this is an important part. There's 3 parts to a public narrative. There's the story of self, right? Why you are in this work, what brings you to this movement. That's really important for just relational experiences. You know, when you open yourself up, when you make yourself vulnerable, it invites others to be in relation to you, to better understand you. So starting with the story of self really is a good grounding for people to connect with you and move into the us. So once you're starting with the story of self, it's important as you move into the us to really realize you're not in this world alone, right? We're all in this together. So the us is why we should all care about this issue, right? Why we should all care about insulin being so hard to come by sometimes. Why we should care about the fact that people need insulin, right? Just as much as they need oxygen. And that's something, again, folks can all relate to needing oxygen. So bringing it back to the us really allows us to be in this fight with you, whether they are directly impacted as you are, they don't have to be, right? Your story of self allows them to connect with you, and the us helps them realize why everyone is impacted by this issue and why we all need to move forward and care together. So then when we move into the now, right, that's helping us realize, okay, now you know why I'm impacted, now you know why this is important to you, but what are we going to do next? That's really important when we're talking about a public narrative and social change, because we always want to have a call to action, right? Let folks know that there's something that we can do about it. There's an issue and it can be fixed. So self, us, now is a big part of public narratives as we're moving towards social change. But public narratives are important because they help us understand the world, right? They help us realize how we're connected and why things are much bigger than our own individual lives. And there's often two popular ways in which folks understand the world. There's the head, right? When we're thinking about the head, we're thinking about data, statistics, facts. So that's why you kind of see all these, microscopes. It's very science and factual based. And this is important, right? It's important to have this component, the head component, because it allows people to really see the hard data and see just see how these structures are created. But if we also think about it, if we're thinking with just the head, if we're communicating, if we're storytelling with just data and just facts, that's not really storytelling. That is like researching, right? Or that is relaying information. However, when we're doing it with just the head, we don't feel it the same, right? And a lot of those statistics, maybe you'll hear them in that moment, but you're not going to necessarily remember them 5 minutes later even, or directly after. So the head is important, but it can't be the only thing. Another way that public narratives help us understand the world is through heart. So that's another way to put a form of expression. When we hear a very moving story, a very emotional story, we remember that, right? That's what really causes us to have those values. But if a story is too much heart, it's overwhelmingly emotional. And at times it could even cause you to not be able to connect so much to the storyteller because perhaps you're even just concerned on how they're processing their emotions at the time. We never want to storytell when we're not ready. So think about that, as we think about how we can tell our stories for social change. Are you comfortable doing it at this moment? Because you don't have to be. You don't have to do anything that you're not ready to do. And so thinking with the heart is good, right? Because it causes us to make that emotional connection. But we don't want to get too emotional that people are just lost in emotion and not grounded in anything. So that moves us to needing both, right? We really, when we're storytelling, we need a combination of the data and we need a combination of your individual personal experience, because combining those two is what really allows us to have an emotionally invested but mindfully grounded framework to then take action, right? If it's too much head, people aren't going to remember it. If it's too emotional, people might just be stuck with all of those emotions and not be able to take action. So here we have this cute little graphic of them both coming together, lighting a light to really emphasize the ideas, right? And emphasizing how these things work together, because that's the next step, is we need to take action. So that's kind of a lot. So to even ground us even more, when you build your own story, your story should have a very clear challenge. Whatever it may be, perhaps it's having to sit on the phone, right, with your health insurance provider. Perhaps it's struggling to communicate, like someone mentioned right before, with your employer on your needs in the workplace. Or as a student, right, perhaps it's struggling even as a young student, right? We're talking type 1 diabetes, even as a child, you know, perhaps it's not being able to have your classmates really understand your own experience and your own needs. So your challenge should be very, very clear. When someone hears your story, they should be able to identify your challenge very clearly. And then your story should always have a choice, right? What did I do next? What was that moment that caused me to act, right? That caused me to stick up, to stand up to my employer, or to really advocate for yourself on the phone with your insurance. Whatever it is, you should have a very clear choice in your story as well. And then from that choice is the outcome. What happened? You know, what happened when a young person advocates for themselves at school? What's the reaction from their classmates? That outcome should be very clear. And that should also be how we're moving people to realize that they can take action as well, right? That choice, having people realize that when you make a choice, they can make a choice too, and that this outcome can happen together. And throughout all of that, you'll see at the bottom here, this moral line. You should be infusing throughout all of this values and morals and what's important to you, right? Advocating for yourself, like I mentioned on the phone with your insurance, that's something a lot of people can relate to, right? So just saying like, I deserve everything that I need, can really be something that grounds folks in morals as well. So as you're building your story, those three components are something to really think about: the challenge, the choice, and the outcome. What was the challenge that you were facing? What was the choice that you made as a result? And what is the outcome after the fact? So as we're thinking about this, also continue to think about the story of self, right? Because that's really how you're going to talk about your challenge. What is it that makes your story unique? And then as we move into the story of us, right? That's kind of the choice component. What can I do? What can you do? And then when we move into the sense of now, that's when we really see the outcome. So as we're thinking about developing your story, I do storytelling trainings a lot. And usually when I start, people are like, well, I don't have a story, which is hilarious, because if you're on this call today, if you're on this conference, you have a story. Something brought you here. And often it involves some very intentional and courageous introspection to think about what is my story? Where did it start? So just a few bullet points that I would love to run through and expand on are: what are the experiences in your life that have shaped your values and led you to this cause, right? So everyone has a different life experience. So everyone's story should be a little bit different. Maybe it's your racial background, right? Maybe it's your gender identity that's also included in this story, because those are your unique experiences in your life and the values that come with that. That have led you to this cause. Often, as we just heard on the last call too, this isn't a one-issue fight for many of us, right? If you could be type 1 diabetic, but perhaps you're also in a lower socioeconomic class, right? or whatever those different intersections are. Developing your story and thinking about all of that and thinking about how unique your experience is because of those various identities really allows you to create your own unique story. And even if someone doesn't share those identities, they can relate, right? They can relate to your values that you're expressing through all of that. And then this point right here, when did you first care about being heard? As you're continuing in your advocacy, what was it, right? What was it that caused you to stand up for yourself? Because that's a big part of your choice in your story. What was it that you were facing that you said, not anymore, you know, I need to act, which leads us to that lessons to learn in every single story. And so include that in your storytelling, because although maybe you think a lesson is easily understandable, communicating that thoroughly really helps ground everyone else in your story as well. What were the circumstances, the place, the colors, the sounds? This is probably my favorite part of storytelling, because I feel like this is kind of what takes us back to those classic storytelling components that we had before. But where were you, right? Where were you when you feel like you had to act? When you felt like you had to act? What was the environment like? What was the day like? Including those components in your story. You know, perhaps you're sitting in a doctor's office and you can talk about, you know, what the doctor's office room smelled like, or, you know, what the paper that you're sitting on the bed felt like. Those are things that folks can relate to. And when we're talking about those specific circumstances, right? Maybe it's how mad you were, or maybe it was, you know, an emotion. When we include those emotions, those feelings, those sensations, right? Those five senses, it allows people to be in our story, not just hear our story, but it's like they're moving through our story with us. And that's a really important part of storytelling, especially when we're thinking, how do we get people to act, right? If you can get them to feel those emotions, to understand the struggle that you were going through, to really be in that room, in that space, in that moment with you. Those circumstances really allow people to take action. So our next slide is avoiding the pitfalls when it comes to storytelling. This can be difficult. We want to tell the story. We want to be clear. We want to be specific. We don't want to get too much in, you know, as much as we want to tell the details, we don't want to be confusing or get people off track. We want to be very specific with our challenge, with our choice, with our outcome. So when we have that framework, it really does allow us to be more specific. So tell the story, not about the story. Be specific, be vivid, be clear. But be ready. That is a big component to all of this. Therapy versus vulnerability. And I do see some questions coming in the chat, so we will have time to answer those too. But therapy versus vulnerability, right? This was like that heart image that we saw, which was just that exploding heart. Don't tell a story you're not ready to. You don't have to. Your story is yours to share when and if you ever want to. No one is going to force you to tell your story. And if they are, you should consider if that's a safe space for you. Therapy versus vulnerability. We don't want to share too much of that emotional space, just because it can be very overwhelming for yourself, overwhelming for the audience. But vulnerability does help, right? It does help folks to realize, like, you were scared, or you were crying, or you were emotional. And often too, when we see a public speaker that does get in touch with their emotions, and not even a public speaker, but just someone that we're interacting with, when we see someone who isn't afraid to shed a tear, that also moves us. So it's just about kind of perfecting your story to the right amount of vulnerability, which takes time to do. So don't be too hard on yourself too if you're not there yet, because your story is going to continue to change. Don't tell your whole life when you tell your story. Pick a couple really important points. As many of us have, you know, an entire background, right? We don't need to hear all of that necessarily. There's ways that we can introduce it, but be specific with your story. Pick 2 or 3 points. Don't give us your life resume like on the next point. Keep it concise. Stick to the purpose. If you're advocating for yourself, if you're advocating for insulin access or whatever it may be, say that, right? You don't need to tell us every other detail if it doesn't necessarily help your story, help promote your story. So be short. Your story shouldn't be longer than 3 minutes. This is kind of a very traditional tip. I do think in different settings, right, your story might be a lot shorter. Your story might be a lot longer, but you should pretty much, when you're creating a story, always have a 3-minute version, kind of like a stump is what it's often called in like political spaces, right? That will just help you stick with a short amount of time, because anything after 3 minutes, people get lost, right? I know sometimes we see it too when we're just scrolling on our phone. If we see a long video, we might keep scrolling. So it's important to realize that, right, with our storytelling, what environment we're already living in, especially as we're living in this digital world. Your story should be concise, but never feel rushed. Never feel rushed to tell your story either, because you deserve all the time that you need. And stick to the structure. Stick to that challenge, choice, and outcome structure to just allow the listener and yourself to have a very clear story. And you don't necessarily need to write your story. I mean, you know your story better than anyone else, and no one can tell you that your story is wrong. I think it's really important to remember that. You know yourself better than anyone else does. So stick to that structure. You can write it down the first time, but once you really start just realizing, this is my story, I know my story, I know what happened, that challenge, choice, outcome is going to be really effortless after a while. This is pretty much our last slide, and we'll get to the questions as well. Your story always changes, right? Because you're growing, you're going to continue to grow, but your story changes too, depending on your audience, right? Maybe you're speaking with legislators, right? Maybe you're challenging big pharma, who knows? Maybe you're telling your story on social media. Maybe it's just in a series of 5 tweets, you're talking about what you're going through, and you can use a hashtag for that, right? So you're not going to have the same story that you tell to perhaps your senator that you tell to maybe your Facebook feed, right? It's going to be different. Same thing with family. Your 3-minute story can be adjusted to seem much more natural, and it can be something that you tell your family at dinner or whatever it may be, right? But the connection that you have with your family is also going to be very different from the storytelling type that you do with social media. Maybe you're doing it for a fundraiser, right? For a social cause. So then that story is going to be quite a bit different because you want to get people to donate. So think about that, right? If your story is changing a little bit, depending on your audience, that's going to also change how you tell your story. Maybe with talking to senators, we still need to keep that very emotional component, but maybe they want some more of those statistics. Maybe a fundraiser wants more of the statistics, but maybe your family wants to hear more about you. Telling it at a rally, right? The emotion at a rally is going to be a lot different than when you're talking to a legislator, right? The volume of your story and how you bring people along. Or maybe you're telling your story at work to advocate for yourself. And so you don't want to get as personal at work. So the way that we tell our story is going to continue to change. We're going to continue to evolve and grow and learn. Society is going to continue to change. So our stories are always going to continue to adapt as we tell them. So maybe you have one story, but it's going to have different components when you're talking to different audiences. So that is mostly the end of my slides. I do just want to promote, share your story, because your story is unique and it's powerful and it can create social change. I promise you that. I have my Twitter on here if folks do want to stay connected. My DMs are open. I'm happy to communicate with folks and thankful to be on here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now as I pop in and see what some of these questions are.
Thank you so much, Chelcie.
Okay.
So here,
yeah, absolutely.
We do have a few minutes for questions here. So I see one in the box here, and I think it's worth answering just so that we can underline this point. Iman is asking, do you really think anyone can tell their story? I'm so interested in storytelling, but I'm not sure I can be a good storyteller and really convey my emotions and experience.
Everyone is a good storyteller in so many ways. And like I said, your story is so unique. So for anyone to tell you it's not a good story, that's not for them to say. Your story is valuable just as you are valuable and unique. And Iman, I'd be happy to connect with you more too as you're thinking about, how can you convey those emotions? Because they're natural, they're really natural. So sometimes just needing someone to kind of identify them for you and pull them out is helpful. So my Twitter is at Chism-Vargas if you want to stay connected.
Thanks so much, Chelcie. And yeah, and there are so many, I'm glad you're highlighting Twitter because there are a lot of different forums that people can use to tell their stories. Right now, we're in the middle of our digital demonstration emphasizing the importance of lowering the list price of insulin so people have the opportunity to tell their story there. You mentioned political rallies, you mentioned, with your friends and family. I guess trying to connect to a topic from earlier today also, do you have any recommendations for allies who are talking about what brought them to the Insulin for All fight to make sure that in telling our stories, we're still centering the experiences and important perspective of people with diabetes in achieving insulin for all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think that's just specific to this movement, right? It's for any movement. You have to really consider, am I the best storyteller for something, right? Or should I pass the mic to someone who is more impacted? However, we do know that there are more folks without type 1 diabetes than with. So we all realize we all need to get into this fight. And we really need to frame it as a human rights issue, because I think that's what really allows us to jump into it a lot easier when we realize, insulin is just as necessary as oxygen for folks. How can you not get behind and rally? So I think it's important to realize when it is your space to share it, to step in and advocate for someone else, but also when can you find someone to directly tell their story and you can simply, give them that opportunity or pass them the mic to do so. But it's not just an issue that impacts folks with type 1 diabetes. This is, right, like an insurance issue. This is an intersectional fight itself. Like we just heard on the last call, it's not just like you're someone with type 1 diabetes. Maybe you're also Black, maybe you're also gay, whatever it is. There's so many reasons that we all should get involved in this fight. But it's just kind of seeing where is your place to do so.
Absolutely, and thank you for that, because on all of the calls today, I think we've heard about the importance of storytelling and of sharing people's perspectives, and especially from those who may be traditionally crowded out of discussions. So with the racial equity panel, with the LGBTQ plus disparities conversation, I appreciate that answer a lot. And so thank you so much for joining us today. That was really wonderful, and we appreciate you.
Thank you folks so much for having me. I'd love to stay connected and keep fighting. Hey, I'm in it with y'all.
Sounds great. Yeah, everyone on the call today knows the importance of telling their story to win change. And being able to tell it well is a critical skill for any advocate to have. And as Chelcie emphasized, anyone can learn to tell their story well, and every story is valuable. Speaking of stories, we're joined again now by Diana Jones to share more about her own journey to becoming an advocate for Insulin for All. Diana, welcome back.
Thanks, Eli. And thank you, Chelcie. So yeah, I mean, that was amazing. Chelcie, I learned so much. And I guess I just want to start by saying, I hope that you saw the slide that was up just before I started talking that said embracing type 1 in your story. Chelcie, I learned so much from you, just mainly, I guess, first of all, like I was going to begin by telling my story, which is in here. But I'm not going to do that because you suggested that we find places within the piece that are turning points and pivot points, and we'll save this massive volume of my life's journey for another time. Ha 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 ha. Okay, so what I would like to offer today is a sort of overview in which I present some challenges that I faced at each stage of my life, and then sort of what helped me to embrace type 1 diabetes at each stage. So I'll begin by saying that I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 11, and I'm now, okay? Ha 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 again. I was raised where a woman never tells her age, but I am a proud 36 years old. So that means that I've had type 1 diabetes for 25 years. And Chelcie, like you mentioned, I want to begin my story, again, being diagnosed at 11, by sort of taking you to the point in time where I experienced a shift. When there was a change, a landmark change for me. So what I'd like to do, bear with me for just a moment, is take you back to when I was 21. And in order to do that, I'm gonna ask that you join me as I become more of who I was at 21, this turning point in my life. So, right, as Chelcie is saying, there are different points in our stories, and we're different people at different points in our stories. And it's important to recognize and reflect and see who you were at each period of time so that you can be honest with yourself about where you are and how you can embrace diabetes at each stage. Okay, so I'm 21. No, wait, my posture's worse. Okay, and let's talk about the tastes and the sights and the five senses that I'm experiencing during this pivot point in my life. Well, my mouth is dry, because I'm nervous, and my heart is pounding because I'm about to speak something personal to my heart, and I don't smell much of anything. It's a dimly lit open mic room, and I come up to the mic and I say, this is, I think, a big declaration that I will maintain. You see, I've decided that I'm through with waiting, letting my life sit marinating, thinking that something or someone will turn up the fire and then suddenly I'll be alive, enlightened, and inspired. You see, I can't just think and feel and write away, cross my fingers and hope that tomorrow's a better day. You see, I think it's like I've grown accustomed to thinking vaguely that there's a something, a someone, a force I couldn't name, anything outside of me where I could place blame. It's like there's this big something that haunts me, taunts me, ails me constantly, whirls me, twirls me, smoothie blend swirls me. It's like you add some clutter and some ambiguity, a little bit of, is it you or is it me? A dash of denial so that I don't see the truth. It's like I've just been avoiding growing out of my youth. I've been searching and struggling, trying to grasp a concept, a thought that can save me, unenslave me, finally enable me to ignite the cessation of this obscure personal analysis that has resulted in nothing more than progression paralysis. But life is too short to waste my mind. A fantastic mechanism and one of my greatest gifts. It's like, I think, therefore I am. And that's a portrait of me as an able, I've got the potential to keep it stable, blessed individual cultivating and perpetuating her existence, no longer snubbing adulthood with tenacious resistance. And breath is sometimes hard to find. It's hard to say, Diana, take the time, turn off the drama and stop. You know, this is your life. You have the starring role. And I admit I like the sound of my own voice, but I got no real right to complain if I make my reality dramatic by choice. And there's no big something that I can't escape or find. And if at 21 years old or ever I resign and choose to throw away my time, then I'm the one who's handed laziness and self-pity, a big gluttonous portion of syrupy satisfaction. Because, you know, it's like I can't really get what I want in life unless I'm honest, ask for help, and take the necessary action. So 21-year-old me finds a pivot point. And I share that with you because, like Chelcie said, it was a turning point for me, but also because, as my slide said, I think for me, one of the most important things about type 1 diabetes has been embracing the fact that it's in my story. We all have different relationships to type 1 diabetes and to diabetes, but it's in my life. And so I just want to empower everyone to recognize that if it means something to you, that you exist first, and diabetes is in your story. So yeah, now what I want to share is just sort of like the different stages of my life where I've had challenges and then how I've embraced having type 1 diabetes during those different stages, in hopes that it will help you if there's someone in your life who is living with diabetes at that time, or it may help you directly, whatever your relationship to type 1 might be. So between the ages of 11 and 15, right, some of the apparent challenges, but ones that were personal to me, were going through puberty. The newness of diabetes and this overwhelming desire to fit in. So the types of things that helped me to embrace having type 1 diabetes during that age range was a really kind-hearted and knowledgeable healthcare team. You know, I guess I'm like a lot of people in that I had an endocrinologist who didn't have such a big heart and was very smart. I imagine he had a big heart. Honestly, what do I know? But it came across to little 11-year-old me like this was a disease, and if I had the right information, I'd do the right thing. But there were a few nurse practitioners and I guess diabetes educators who approached me as if they approached me and taught me about diabetes from the place where I was. They met me where I was, and that was 11. You know, so I think that if you are a young person with diabetes, try to ask for help from your parents or your community, your peers, or whoever it is that is a trusted adult in your life, to outfit yourself with a team of people who are going to acknowledge the breadth and complexity and difficulty of what it is you're trying to do. I also had a really great peer group at camp. So I went away to a type 1 diabetes sleepaway camp. So I think that was definitely a privilege, but it's something that if you're a parent and can provide a digital support group at this time for your child or someone in your family living with type 1 diabetes, that was a great source of help and support, and allowed me to embrace this new thing into my life. And then also, the fact that my parents were such a big part of the care and education. You know, I became 15 and I kind of wanted to snub my parents, but in retrospect, the fact that they were still part of learning and trying to make sure that I understood and could manage this condition to the best of my teenage ability, that was something that was really fantastic and allowed me to embrace this, living with this. Okay, between the ages of 16 and 21, I would say the biggest challenges that I faced in embracing type 1 diabetes were around, okay, it's probably no surprise, but the temptations of substances and a teenage lifestyle. Food and dating and sexuality were all challenges that were now present in my life more so than before, and were things that I honestly had to address as a teenager. And also this idea of I was on my way to adulthood. So I think that there are a lot of additional pressures that people between the ages of 16 and 21 face when it comes to living with and embracing their type 1 diabetes. Everyone's experience is unique. I'm just sharing mine in hopes that if you are someone who is going through this stage at this time, I can be a source of hope and light. And if you're dealing or working with someone who is in that age group, that you can also have a deeper understanding of what might be going through their head. Some of the things that helped me during that stage were one-on-one time with my parents. Again, as much as I tried to push, I was a teenager, as much as I tried to push them away, they were consistent and they were present, and I'm so grateful for that. And, you know, we all have different ways of creating family. So you don't have to be a parent. You might be an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, whatever supportive and loving family you can build to really be present for a person with type 1 diabetes, please do that. And another thing that helped me during the ages of 16 and 21 was therapy. So, you know, if that is something that's available to you, it might be hard to open up because diabetes is a big weight and it doesn't go away. But if that's an available tool for you to utilize, it was definitely something that helped me to embrace this condition. Between the ages of 21 and 26, getting old, huh? Between the ages of 21 and 26, some of the biggest challenges that I faced in embracing my type 1 diabetes were living abroad, managing diabetes at work, and as you've heard from other people, the cost of supplies. Life abroad was complex because I was in a new place. Fortunately, it was, I spent time abroad studying in London, and later I spent time studying in Mozambique. So in London, I can just speak English and you know, navigate with a fair amount of ease. But again, I think for me, I'm someone where newness is overwhelming and scary. So that always presents a challenge. Diabetes at work, I think, was something that was challenging because I, at that time, was working part-time jobs. And so there was a lot of like flexibility and inconsistency. And we all know that routine is really paramount to helping to manage diabetes. So that was a challenge for me. And then the cost of supplies, right? Because when you age off of your parents' insurance, all of a sudden you are a young person who thinks that you knew how to take on the world with these out-of-pocket costs that are beyond what you've ever conceived of. And that's not everyone's experience, but that was my experience. So some of the things that helped me during that very challenging stage of my life were having a really close mentor, someone who I could confide in and who was there for me and let me talk about whatever it was that I needed support with, diabetes included. Another thing that was really helpful for me to embrace my diabetes at that time was a good group of core friends. And so I think that's probably more important now for so many of us, right? Because we're living apart from each other. So rely on one another and turn to each other and provide support where you can. And I also think that another thing that was really beneficial to me and allowed me to embrace my diabetes at this time was having goals outside of diabetes, right? It just sort of harkens back to me saying that I am the starring role of my life and diabetes is in it, but without me, there's no diabetes in this life. So when I was in that age range, I had a lot of hard times in high school. And so I went to undergrad later than some, and I was determined to graduate, and I was determined to seek out opportunities for graduate school. So having these goals that made me feel more like I was just like everybody else, those were tremendously helpful. All right, we got 2 more stages left in life, and I guess 2 minutes to go. I can do it. Some of the challenges between the ages of 26 and 30, toxic relationships, and the stress of managing grad school. Toxic relationships, I'm sure you can understand what those means. If you've got people giving you bad juju and bad energy in your life, get them out. Diabetes is hard enough without people bringing you down. And as Chelcie was saying, right, like you matter, your story matters. Take ownership of yourself, find your center, and only let people in who are good for you. Managing stress. We all know that our blood sugars go up and down if we're more stressed, but some of the things that have helped me or that helped me during that time were living alone. I think that it gave me time to reflect and really put myself out into the world as an independent human being, and keeping in touch with my parents, but doing it from a distance. I think that for me, one of the really valuable things about being an adult living with diabetes is my relationship to my parents as a separate human being, and everyone's different with that, but it's an ever evolving thing. Okay, and so then from, let's say, 30 to now, where I find myself with T1 International, some of the biggest challenges that I feel like I'm facing are the tired relentlessness of diabetes, having new health concerns, right? Like I'm getting older and that's the reality of life. And so I think there's stresses and thinking about weight management and wanting to make sure that I'm the healthiest that I can be for the longest amount of time possible. Those things are hard. And also onboarding my life partner. I've been with the same wonderful gentleman for almost 10 years now. And so I think it's a next stage of life where it's really important for the conversations about diabetes to become more than like, oh, did you check your blood sugar? And for me personally, really about a deeper understanding of the condition. What has helped me to manage during this time? T1 International, this space. And as Chelcie was saying, feeling like I'm ready to tell some of my story, or at least figure out my story. Yeah, and Dr. Nagra yesterday, I believe, was talking about raising public awareness and all being part of this broader movement together. I think that that's something I just want to end on, that, you know, as other people have said, you are the center of your story. And so if we can find these things to connect with people who don't have type 1 that we really just all understand, we are going to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was really, really excellent. I wasn't expecting to close out the day with another performance, but that was really beautifully done. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I always find it really meaningful to know how people have gotten involved in this fight, and I appreciated your openness and creativity in sharing with everyone. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Diana is T1 International's development coordinator. So I'm going to take one thing off her plate today by reminding everyone that while this event is totally free to attend, we would deeply appreciate any donations that folks are able to make in support of our work in the pursuit of insulin for all. To make a donation or learn more about getting involved in advocating with us, you can check out our website at www.t1international.com. I believe that link is in the chat box. In addition to financial support, T1 International is also looking for a new member or members of our board of trustees. We're especially interested in adding patients with type 1 diabetes, especially patients of color and members of the LGBTQ plus community, to ensure an array of patient voices are in the room. We're also interested in adding folks who know and understand the nonprofit sector with previous senior leadership or board experience. We're open to adding more than one person, so if you or someone you know is qualified, please feel free to check out the posting on our website and consider applying. And if you haven't already, please add your voice to our digital demonstration, calling on pharma to make one decision: lower the list price of insulin now. You can find graphics, helpful facts, and more info on our website, which is linked in the chat. To close out this year's workshop, we're joined again by Fiona Mason, T1 International USA's National Director. Fiona, take it away.
First, thanks, Diana, for giving us a peek into one of your many starring roles. It was a joy. And thanks, Eli, for being our chief ham operator and guiding us through these last 2 days. And to Monique Johnson for supporting all our tech needs, and to the entire T1 International team of Allison, Al, Eli, Beth, Chloe, Diana, Katie, Liz, and Marissa for pitching in. I want to give a special shout out to Al, who took this project on in her first few weeks in a new job and pulled this amazing event together. We wouldn't be here without your leadership, so huge thank you from all of us. And thank you to each of the presenters and each of you as attendees for these last 2 days of powerful vulnerability with what you shared and the questions you asked and answered. These sessions have served as a reminder of how far we have come and how much more work there is to do, and how, as a white-led organization, we need to be held to account for commitments we've made as they relate to equity. And as Vivian and many of the other panelists suggested, we look forward to continuing the conversation, not annually, but regularly in our work. We've seen and heard and felt what it means to live with and therefore struggle with life with type 1 diabetes, especially with the intersection of impacted identities. We've seen how prejudice and profiteering and patents and poverty impact this community from Pakistan to Panama to Pensacola. We've been inspired by the reminder of the various forms advocacy can take and the many ways we can advocate. We've had space to think about all the unlearning we have to do, and the listening and the amplifying and the power sharing, not just today, but always. We hope you leave today feeling more informed on the many issues that intersect with diabetes and the access and affordability crisis in the US and beyond, and that you will join us in our call to action to support Insulin for All movement in whatever way works the best for you. We can't thank each one of you enough for taking the time and energy during this most difficult of times to join us this weekend. Though the impact of COVID-19 and its many deaths, the economic downturn, the environmental devastation, the rise in violence and protests in support of Black lives, the isolation and all the many unknowns have looked different for each and every one of you, we recognize and appreciate the differing struggles that 2020 has laid bare for each of us. So we hope that today provided you, as it has for us, some hope that change is possible, because our community remains strong, our voices echo across the globe, change becomes real because of community. We can't win without community. We can't do what we do without each one of you. Together we are better. Together we will achieve Insulin for All. Till we connect again, and with endless thanks from the T1 International team to each one of you. Brady Bunch style, we say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.